Because I see some of our commentators from Dorothy Lane in the audience, and most of us are familiar with that situation, so they'll provide a little more detail. But I did talk with our county attorney, Scott Twito, early last week after our meeting to ask him about the status of Mr. Morris, who's been the focus of a lot of the attention on Dorothy Lane. And I got what I thought at the time was probably a positive report. Apparently, Mr. Morris, right before our last meeting, had been arrested based on, I'm not sure exactly what, perhaps failure to abide by previous bail conditions. I believe he was also arrested on a bench report for, on a bench warrant for failure to appear in advance of a trial that was scheduled for September 19th, I'm sorry, I believe. And however, my understanding is that he is now out on bail. I just got that from our Dorothy Lane residents, but they frankly know more detail than I do, so we'll ask them to clarify on that. Scott Twito told me that he would give us some sort of a written status report concerning the situation with Mr. Morris and various charges have been brought against him, and now his bail situation. I have not received that, but based on what I just learned, it'll be particularly important that we get an update from the county attorney. But with that, we'll open it up for public comment on any item on the agenda or not on the agenda. Go ahead and come forward. Just ask that you tell us your name and address and keep your comments to 3 minutes.
Wesley Dunn, Dorothy Lane, OP Clearinghouse at gmail.com. I'm assuming Kevin? Yes. Wesley. Kevin reached out to me earlier this week, and we had a good conversation on what he would like from me and what I would like to do also, but I haven't clarified everything. Council, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for allowing me to speak for 3 minutes. I will keep it at 3. I do want to apologize for disrespecting your time last week. Just let me know if I disrespect anybody in any way. If I say anything, please let me know, because if I don't know, I don't have a chance to make amends with that or fix that issue. So I apologize for last week for overdoing my time. Tonight,
fine. Go ahead.
Tonight I will try to keep it at 3 minutes. So I just want to clarify the reason why I'm here again. Endangerment, harassment, and I'll even say it again. William Anthony Felton, you really didn't inherit this problem, but the council did. We've known about this problem for 5 years. St. John has known about this problem for 5 years. Kevin has known about this problem for over 5 years. So with that being said, y'all have inherited this problem. Now, we as the citizens want to see something done about it. We all know that there's no room in the jail. We know that, but that still does not mean that we can't take responsibility and do what we need to do as citizens and officials of the city of Billings. We have taken a step towards the right direction with this problem property task force. But why did it take a Hollywood hillbilly to bring that to your attention when you've known about it for 5 years? Why did it take me to do that? Why did it take us to do that? That's being reactive. That's not being proactive. So with that being said, yes, we're on the right step, but we need to declare something. We need to do something right now. We see the problems in our city. We hear about it. We hear about the shootings, but we have got to do something, guys. And gals. Sorry. But like I said, y'all are elected. We understand that, but y'all are elected to do a job, so let's do it. And I'm here to help. I'm here to help in any way I can. Task force, I'm here to help in any way I can, Kevin. just reach out to me and let me know. So I got 4 seconds. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
Amber Dunn, Dorothy Lane. Hello, Kevin. It's nice to meet you. I would like to say I would like to volunteer to be number 2 in the Problem Property Task Force. I am willing to help in any way, shape, form, clean up, talking to neighbors, whatever needs to be done. I'm willing to help in that as well. I came up here with quite a few things I wanted to say, but I'm just going to sum it up. Yesterday, an article came out on Big Sky, yourbigsky.com, where they were talking about the teen shooters feel emboldened. And I don't know if you guys read it, but Lieutenant Lennox quoted exactly what all 4 of us have been saying. There's no respect for authority out there. None of these people know that they're going to go to jail and stay in jail because they know they're not. And that's a serious problem for us as a community altogether. Being on Facebook, not sure if you guys see, but there's so much talk in this town about why aren't these streets different? Why isn't the crime cleaned up? I encourage them to come speak because without everybody speaking commissioner-wise here, which we will be going next Tuesday, just so everybody knows, it's hard to get off work, but I'm gonna make it work. So, I mean, we are trying every way we can, but again, we would like to help clean up not just Problem Property 200, Problem Property, all of them. So that's all I have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jacqueline Garcia, Dorothy Lane. So we've been talking about all the problems. One of the things that I've noticed is a lot of the shootings and a lot of the teenage problems has been happening in the early morning, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Like the rims, that's supposed to be shut down. It's 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. Why are there people on the rims past 10 p.m.? Why isn't that enforcement happening? We have officers that patrol the parks in the day on their bikes, but why not at night? These children are allowed to be out in the street. The first time an officer sees them, they're supposed to interact with them, contact their parents, contact city council, and city council is supposed to send a letter to the parents and let them know the next time they'll be fined. That's just what the ordinance I read today is. So is it happening that way though? Are you guys finding out these kids? No one's being held accountable. Everyone wants to say, well, you can't blame the parents for the kids, single parents work nights. I've been a single mom. I've done it. You find someone to sit with your kid. You know, it's not the best thing, but there are different options instead of letting your kids roam the street. I recently found out from my son, you know, once they turn 18, they do true confessions. He told me that he was one of those kids that would ride his scooter up to McDonald's at 5 o'clock in the morning to go get cookies or something. Why? I don't know. Was I irritated at him? Of course. But no one ever told me because I would have stopped it. The parents need to be held accountable for their children because nothing's going to change. If we aren't holding the parents accountable for them to hold the children accountable, how is there going to be a change at all? They talk about the dysfunction has been going on for years. 1984, there were, 75 aggravated assaults, 275 burglaries, and 1,555 larceny thefts of under the age 18. It's been a problem for a long time. That's 1984. We need to do something to come together to stop these kids and help them because they're just going to repeat what they're seeing at home if no one steps in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Sean from Dorothy Lane, and I can probably take all 3 minutes, let alone 24 hours of all your guys' time. There's multiple ways to get in contact with me, and I think a lot of people have my contact information. I just wanted to touch base quickly on a couple things. Seems like a lot of people in different agencies are passing the buck to the next person constantly. No one's taking pride in their work or their job to get stuff done. And I shouldn't say no one, there are people that do it. But I spoke with Commissioner Osland on the phone last week, and I was talking about jail expansion, what we can do, what are some things. You have your meetings during the working man hours, what can we do to get them outside of there, a bunch of different things. And on the jail expansion topic, he mentioned for about 20 plus years from today's date forward, there's not even looking into anything jail expanding. There's nothing that they can do because this council wastes budget and repurpose budget where it needs to go. You guys put it elsewhere. He also said until the Mexican border gets shut down, drugs are going to be rampant. There's going to be a lot of problems, and there's nothing that a jail expansion can do, let alone you guys are over 15 people short in the county jail. Once you do the expansion, you're going to need 50 more plus people, and he brought it up again, how you guys keep repurposing the money and spending it elsewhere on apartment buildings, so and so forth, other than where it needs to go. So I just wanted to bring that to light. And I also think there needs to be a change, and I think needs to be a lot of changes, and one of them, I think it's time for Sheriff Linder to leave office. I think he needs to put his resignation letter in the box and hand deliver it to everybody, and we need to get somebody in there that actually cares and is, whether they're more qualified, better off to do the job, or actually get the job done. And this passing the buck really, really needs to stop. We need answers, and we need them now. And once again, my number's out there, name's out there. I welcome anybody to get hold of me.
Thank you, Sean. While I've got you, just a sec, because this is really important. Did County Commissioner Osland express support for building a new jail using, in part, county dollars, since it's a county facility?
If he's in support of that,
Yeah.
then he either lied to me or he lied to everybody else out in the public.
No, I don't know. I'm just asking, did he express support? Because that would be a great step forward, in my opinion.
There was no support on his end. There was none given. He doesn't see any jail expansion. He doesn't see anything happening for 20 plus years from today's date.
Going into the future?
And going into the future, there's no need for jail expansion because the Mexican border is open and that needs to be closed as of first. And as well as there's some city council on here that somehow keeps getting voted in, not knowing how they get voted in. They shouldn't be here doing their job. They're not doing their job, repurposing money. There's a lot of things that Commissioner Osland has said.
Well, thank you for reaching out, and I would encourage you to continue to do so and encourage county commissioners to at least investigate jail expansion.
Hopefully he takes my phone call after this meeting.
Okay, well, all right, thank you very much. Jackie, you had a quick,
Yes, I forgot, you'd asked about the RM problem
yes.
and expansion. So yes, he did get out Thursday. Yes, we had people in our driveway Thursday night, Friday night. Well, he's gone. I had people driving in my driveway and sitting there and leaving. And he is supposed to be off of formal probation in November on the 17th. And they're talking about dropping all the current charges that are pending against him.
And did you say his bail was $15,000?
Yes.
Okay. Councilmember Purington?
If you don't mind, I would like to comment about some of the things that Sean said. And you can stay there, Sean. One thing, the city and the county do not commingle their monies. the county jail is totally on the county. The city has to pay top dollar to put our citizens in the county jail. So whether there was a miscommunication with you and the commissioner, I don't know. I know he's not supportive of a jail expansion. And I'm just going to say, if the county would pay their people more, you would probably have full employees at the county jail. So, and whenever you say that there's blame to be given, I am very supportive of our Billings Police Department. And as I mentioned before, we have U.S., state, and local law enforcement in the city of Billings. And I do believe that they are all working towards not only your problem, but a lot of the problems that are going on in Billings. And the other thing is that they all have a certain amount of jurisdiction. And some of the things that you would like done just almost can't be done because they have to work within their jurisdiction, even though they do work together in a lot of cases. So I understand your frustration. I'm frustrated with it too, because, you know, in city council, we don't run the police department. We really don't. And we don't run the county jail. So just know that we're advocating for you, maybe more than what you think we are, but we are advocating for you as well as the other people in the city. And I do believe that our police department and all of our other law enforcement in Billings, they are working. In many cases, they're working together. But you're talking about a legal system that truly is broken. And so they're working. So, and I'm sorry for, you know, the pain that you and your families are experiencing, but it's, I guess, all I can say is it is what it is right now, but it is being worked on. So please know that.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Trickey, very short. We've got an agenda. We haven't got to it yet.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, very shortly. You guys have done a lot of work and talked to a lot of people, but the one place that I've noticed you haven't talked to are the people at the state of Montana level that fund a lot of these programs. They fund the parole program. They set the amount of money that they spend at the county jail, and on and on and on. So our state legislators are someone else who need to be hearing about what you're talking about.
And he's talking to.
Yeah, good.
Which is great. We really do appreciate that. We encourage it at all levels.
Yeah,
Yep.
if you guys want to text us any info, we'll reach out to whoever.
Perfect. Appreciate it. Thank you. Any other public comment before we move on to item number 1? Don't see any, so we'll close the public comment period. And actually, before we get to item number 1, just a couple quick, I should call them announcements. This past week, we had the privilege of having a delegation from Billings come visit, as in Billings, Missouri. And it was very interesting. And next week, for a regular business meeting, I'll bring some of the loot that they brought from their city to give us and display that. And we also have a banner from them, and it was a big deal for us and a big deal for them. So next week we'll give you some more details, and I think it'll be fun. Also, Councilmember, no, Councilmember Roops is going to do that next week. So anything else, Kevin, before we move on to item number 1?
No, nothing to report. Chris is at the International City Managers Association Conference down in Cleveland, Ohio this week. So he's getting some training and education down there. Did want to remind council, I did send out an email, made a little tweak for an item on the agenda for next Monday. There is a old fire station tour at 760 Lake Elmo at 2 o'clock on Wednesday, and you're all invited to that. And it has been noticed and everything in case a quorum of council members does show up.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, council, then we'll move on to our first item, land use and development process update. And I think Monica has that one. So, Monica.
All right. Well, good evening, council. I am here to talk about my favorite topic and your favorite topic, land use. I actually tried to find a joke and land use planner jokes are almost
don't
non-existent.
exist.
So, that was the best opening remark I could come up with. So let's just move through this pretty quickly. We had a presentation in April. They're not presentations, they've been conversations. Conversations in April, conversation in July, and then this is the final one. So I will package everything up and send it to you with all of the information that we've covered now that we're coming to an end. But the point of this session is not to really go over anything new, but is to tie up questions that remained unanswered in those first two sessions. So I had great fun going back and listening to those to make sure that I didn't forget anything. I think we did a good job of answering a lot of things, but we'll cover some things that we didn't get to. Just as a reminder, the whole purpose of this conversation was really to provide a dedicated time to help us all to exchange information and learn from one another about the land use process. And I think we've probably all come to the conclusion that all of these, descriptive words are, in fact, how land use is. And just want to touch on again that process is really important in land use decisions because there are so many regulations, local regulations, state law. It's just really important to be consistent in process. And that's what I think you'll find that staff tries really hard to be consistent in process. It doesn't mean our process is always perfect. It doesn't mean our process doesn't have room for improvement. But also we do have some really good examples of how our process has been good. One of the things I don't think I ever shared with you guys is with the way that we do subdivision findings of fact, we always cross-reference conditions of approval in the findings. And that's something that not all communities do. And actually several years ago, Mako used our findings of fact as an example of how to do an adequate and good job in drafting findings. And so, I think that's something to point out that, we've had some reinforcement where some of the things we're doing are really good. And yes. Okay, so let's get to those burning questions. First, we're going to start with the annexation policy. And I just want to take a minute to say that I know that there's been a couple of emails that have come through in the last, couple of weeks that have also had some land use questions. And so I've tried to incorporate those into this presentation too. So first, we're going to talk about this idea of forced annexation. Specifically, one of the questions that came up was, when the city is annexing property that has been petitioned for annexation and goes by property that is not annexed, how does that work, or is there opportunity for the city to force annexation? Should landowners be concerned that the city's going to force annexation? So just want to briefly touch on that. The fact of the matter is, statutes do allow for cities to force annexation. But also with those statutes comes a variety of requirements. And basically, to force annex, the city has to be willing to foot the bill. So as a practice, the city has not forcibly annexed property. In fact, I can't even think of an example of a forcibly annexed property in the last, 20 years. So it's typically a financial constraint that prevents that. As far as how annexations are handled, we're handling them based on petitions that are coming forward from individual landowners. Most of the time, they do not come in the form of large multi-parcel things. We're talking a singular developer with a plan that they have for future development, not many parcels with many people. So forced annexation is really not something that we're even considering doing, and we just haven't done that through practice. So we've also had some questions about annexation criteria. So our annexation policy was last updated in 2017, and within that policy there are criteria that are laid out. And the reason why you don't always see all of the criteria is because sometimes the criteria doesn't apply. Or we feel like we've adequately handled in the way that we're doing, joint applications, certain aspects of those. So the the criteria areas that have the asterisks on them are the ones that you see regularly and routinely. And that's because those are the givens. This is what it is. These are related to the documents that you have to review. This is specifically related to improvements either in the SIA or the development agreement. These are those unknowns, but also absolutes. Some of the other criteria that we don't spend time focusing on may not always apply. For instance, when it comes to park maintenance districts, we reach out to parks when we get a petition, and they provide guidance to us whether or not a parks maintenance district is either required to be expanded or if a new one is created. I think maybe since 2017, 2018, I think maybe we've had 2 or 3 districts be required to be expanded as a part of the development agreement and conditions of approval. Sometimes properties are commercial, wouldn't have a park maintenance district for that. And sometimes properties are handling their parks with a subsequent action, like say a subdivision. Also, like residential densities, you know, it's a very, it specifically says they should be, not they're required to be, not that they need to be, not that they shall be, it's that they should be. And so that's also just historically hasn't been something that we've focused on. We do think that there is a relationship with zoning there, with our zoning districts are achieving that. And so I guess we can specifically and explicitly mention all 7 moving forward. That's no problem to incorporate into staff reports. But there is a reason of why we've kind of parsed them out and focused on really what is happening at hand with some of those other documents. And then also related to the annexation policy itself, there was a question about going more into detail about the process of how that policy is reviewed. And so that is an annual process where staff, department heads or other staff representatives meet every fall and discuss mostly the map. It's not that the policy itself isn't evaluated, but I would say last year was, or the last time that we met was the first time that we kind of started talking about the philosophy of the annexation policy. The city administrator, Chris Kukolski, comes to those meetings, and he was asking a lot of questions because it's a different tool than he's seen in some of the other communities that he's worked at. And so we did have the time to exchange some information about the pros and cons of our policy, the pros and cons of our limits of annexation map. Because sometimes a designation can create, you know, a county development that then has to be, you know, the leapfrog effect over. So I think we are to a point now, especially based on how many annexations we've done in the last 5 years, especially the last 2 to 3 years, that we have a lot to go on as far as just situations and information and things that we've learned just through having done that many, that we can have a much more in-depth conversation about whether it's time to bring forward actual policy changes. So back to the review process, we do convene, consider the policy, consider the map, and we bring those to you in the form of a staff report with a hearing and a recommendation to change that policy. Anything on annexation before I move on?
Councilmember Trickey and Councilmember Purington.
Just a clarification, I wasn't sure if I heard you right. On the forced annexation point, what I thought I heard you say is that the owner must agree to the cost of the annexation?
No, Councilmember Chiriki. If the city of Billings wished to forcibly annex property, the city would bear the burden of the cost to do so and to provide those services and get those things done. So it has typically been a financial burden that has been avoided because the city would need to absorb it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just comment on that I believe by statute also there's just a plain prohibition on forced annexation of 3 really important types of property: agricultural property, industrial, and most importantly, golf courses. the Highland exemption. Councilmember Purington and Councilmember Bernice and Gillick.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to the forced annexation as well, because living out on the West End, there was that leapfrog to Ironwood. And because of the infrastructure, I think out in the Yellowstone Country Club, that kind of forced that annexation because they were doing their own water treatment, I believe it was, or something, and it was failing. But that was a very contentious type of annexation. And many did feel being forced. And moving forward, whenever you were talking about doing that leapfrog thing, do you foresee that now in the county, and especially with the DNRC working towards this aquifer issue, that there will be people that will be wanting to annex into the city, and it will give that leapfrog effect?
Councilmember Purington, yes, I do think that the city is staring down some probably pretty tough choices in the future. We know that there are several county developments that are, maybe at risk at some point in the future of either having failing infrastructure that is community style. So what I mean by that is a community wastewater facility that is central to all of the lots in that development. And if they're not being properly maintained, depending on if there's an HOA, or any of those things to collect funds to then replace it, they could seriously ask the city, we can't afford to do it, so what does it cost to annex? Can we annex, and can we go through that petition property to annex? I think that will happen. I think that, quite honestly, the Heights is kind of an example of where there was failing infrastructure and it had to be bailed out by the city. And I think we will see that kind of on a subdivision by subdivision basis on the West End. Just those developments on the West End range anywhere from having community wells to individual septics to individual wells and community septics, or community wells and community septics. And some of these systems these days, especially the ones that have been permitted in, I would say, the last 5 years, are very complex and expensive systems that oftentimes are left for the HOA to maintain. And I think we've all lived through experiences of sometimes poorly managed HOAs that have a real lack of funds. I do know that right now the county is in the process through the subdivision regulation amendment effort to actually figure out how they can take that burden from the HOA and create a special improvement district to basically create a financial mechanism to at least be collecting funds, so that when it comes down to it, it's not, hope the HOA did it, but there's the structured kind of tax collection just to try to ensure that those funds are there in the future. And so I do believe we will see something like that come forward. But I think when these systems fail, people will be asking, is it possible to annex?
Just a quick follow-up. I hope it's going to come. So with the annexation along the frontage road, South Frontage Road, there are businesses out there, and this may be completely off topic with this because it's not residential, it's commercial, that there is some that they didn't know that the city was putting in lines and, for the Coca-Cola plant, and maybe it's that other, I can't remember the other big building they're doing out there, but anyway.
Crown Enterprises.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The warehousing, thank you. So those businesses are very concerned that if they do have failures in their septic systems, that they're going to be forced to be annexed into the city. And they were not given an option to protest or anything. Is that, what's the outcome of that?
Councilmember Purington, I think the outcome of that is individual county businesses are really not weighing in on where the city is choosing to make capital improvements. So if the city is choosing to put millions of dollars towards water and sewer infrastructure, they're not making the county connect. I think if you're operating on speculation that if they fail, if let's just say they have a septic system and it fails and they don't have a replacement drain field area, and the DEQ would say, well, you're within 500 feet, so you must connect. That's a possibility, but I would say that in no circumstance would the city ever not consider expansion of infrastructure based on that concern. Because ultimately, either they're gonna need water and they're gonna need the city, and they're gonna wish that the city was there, if they're not, and it'll ultimately be when they're ready to come in. And maybe that is forced sometimes by their circumstances, but it's not forced by the city government. Yeah.
Thank you. Councilmember Neeson-Gulick?
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for clarifying, because I was going to bring that up. That's forced by DEQ, it's not forced by the city. And so, but I do want to touch on force, and one other thing is, you said foot the bill. Can you be more specific on what we actually foot the bill for?
Sure. So when we annex property, one of the things that we're really concerned about is making sure that there is an agreement in place, or that the property is up to city standards: sidewalk, curb, gutter, paving, all of those things. Now, sometimes those don't happen immediately, but the development agreement becomes this binding contract that says, these are the trigger points of when you as the developer have to make these improvements. So we wouldn't be able to have an agreement like that in place. And so when it comes time to make improvements like, say, sidewalk, curb, gutter, in addition to any sort of line extensions, it would be on the city to make those improvements.
Okay, so when we're forced annexing, we actually can't also have the SID requirements as well, is that correct?
Right.
Okay, all right, thank you, that helps. Now, if they're skipping over some of that property where maybe we've done some of the sewer and stormwater infrastructure already, to force annex in that one particular property, then we're probably only looking at maybe road inspection or expansion, curbs and gutters, things like that, or we actually have to develop stuff within their development?
Councilmember Dees, honestly, it depends. It depends on what type of property it is. If it's a commercial business, we do have standards for site development for commercial businesses. But if it's just a residence, that cost could be very minimal, especially if there's already frontage that's been improved. It would really have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Honestly, kind of candidly, I think the biggest expense is what you're the ones that force it. You all do, because it's an action by city council. And so I think the biggest expense is, what would be the reason for you to do that to a property owner that's not asking? So maybe your political clout is an expense. I mean, candidly.
Okay, and then regarding your policy review process, one of the things we always hear about from us is, well, it's a policy matter. We have to develop our policies. We have to come up with the policies. Do you invite council members to these policy review processes where we can be involved in that and helping set those policies?
Councilmember Neese, in the ones that I've participated in, we have not had any sort of council representation there. It's not to say that that's not possible. We have a lot of other examples where we include a council member to be a liaison to council when we're doing studies. A lot of our transportation studies specifically come to mind. So it's absolutely possible to do it in that way. I think also too, your involvement has been on the back end, when we're here, and of course it's, should we delay this, or are there major concerns? I believe a couple of times it's even gone to a work session before it's come here. So I think we have the ability to kind of model that participation in any way that we want, just so long as it's, not a quorum.
Yeah, thank you. I think when it comes time for the policy discussion, maybe not the process, because that's what you're doing, but I would appreciate maybe an invitation, or at least to let us know that maybe we can actually come to those meetings and see what's going on there, become more familiar with the policy that you guys are looking at and what the issues are. So,
sure.
Thanks. And then the only thing, one last thing, Mayor. Sure. I'm going to leave this to Jennifer, but regarding findings of fact.
Wait, are you talking to me or Jennifer?
Okay, I'm going to let her address that. I had some questions about findings of fact, so. All right, thank you.
Councilmember Gulick.
Yes, Councilmember Neese's first question answered mine, or actually you answered it. He asked it, but so I'm good.
Then Councilmember Rowan, Gulick, and Joy.
Thank you. It's Monica, right?
You got it.
Did I call her Jennifer again? I thought I was talking about this, Jake.
I was
You're okay.
confused. I couldn't tell if it was her or me.
Oh,
Sorry, no, this one,
okay.
this one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I appreciate what you do, and I appreciate your appropriate defense of your department's work, because you guys do great work. But I'm going to be a little more stubborn on the findings, because I do think that we can establish a better record. I'm glad that you guys have gotten praise, but I still don't think we are where I would like to be. Sure. So I think there is a way to start looking at some metrics to inform council's understanding of the basis of those recommended findings. So for example, I see a lot of findings, sometimes in annexation, sometimes in zone changes, pick your process, but it'll say something like water and sewer is adequate. We must have some data behind that, right? We project that this development will consume X amount of cubic feet of water, and we have that capacity to treat and process. Or, fire service is adequate. So we project a multifamily housing of this size will generate X number of calls. Our fire department believes they can respond, and that's why we propose this finding. There must be some data that informs the internal staff discussion that I think we can just put on the record to council. I'm not asking you to generate new information, but I think you know things through your well-studied process that could just be put on the official record. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's the conversation. If we need to keep having it, let's have it. If council needs to act, let's do that. But that's where I would like to see us be, just to put some meat behind those numbers. And the one that really sticks for me, and I know that it varies depending on the process, is the data we get from the school district. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't, but I think we could do better in that area just through building our partnerships. And I think it would help council's conversation if they knew, what overcapacity means, or, Lincoln Center said it's adequate, but the principals raised some concerns. I think we could put some data to these findings, and I think we would have a better process if we did.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to I apologize, I'm jumping out of order, but unless we get I tend to agree. Believe it or not, though, when I was on the planning board, I was the first one to say, the statute requires findings of fact, and they didn't exist at all. So in that ways, we have come a long way, baby. It's amazing. So kudos in that way. But I do think we could be more specific, and I think the school district example is a great one. The other one that always pops out is growth policy, because our statute requires, I forget what the exact language is, compliance with. And this is a 100-page aspirational, often fairly fuzzy document, and we kind of tend to cherry pick, if we like something, 4 or 5 things that we like, and then we cite those, and if we don't, then a couple others. And that's not a problem with staff. That's just an inherent inadequacy about the statute and what that requires. The only thing I could see is we could adopt a policy about what it means to, quote, comply. Or whatever the right exact terminology is, substantially, and have some more detailed test. But that is for somebody a lot smarter and a lot more time and energy than me. So I apologize for the interruption. We were, Councilmember Gulick, were you in?
So Councilmember Nice's first question was my question.
Covered you, okay. Okay, then Councilmember Joy and Boyette.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. Yeah, and I thought that at one time, state statute actually says that you can't deny an annexation based on the schools being not over capacity, but it doesn't clearly say that exactly how many numbers. It doesn't give it a number, but also to clarify that if you come forward with those numbers so that we understand if state statute actually would allow us to say, no, that can't, we'll deny that annexation on the basis that the school in that area is already at capacity.
Councilmember Joy, I would have to go back and look at the annexation statutes. It is specifically stated in the Subdivision and Planning Act. It says that you cannot deny based on the growth policy or the school information alone. You can't use that as a singular reason to do it. I think you could make the case of, X, Y, and Z and include that in X, Y, and Z, but you can't say the school said they're at capacity, so we're just not willing to do this. That's what that statute means, and it's related to subdivision.
Oh, thank you for that clarification. Now for my question. When we're talking about annexation and we're talking about a desired density, how does that apply when we are annexing a parcel that is not yet developed and they aren't using our new zoning tool where they may develop in the county with the intention of coming into the city? How does that desired density come in if we're just looking at a parcel of land? And the second thing is, I'm thinking of an annexation that was on the west end, and there's a very small private college that exists that chose not to come in. And I never quite understood what cost would it be for that very small, it's a large piece of property, but it's a small school, not a very heavily populated, dense school. What objection would they have to coming into the city when they're completely surrounded? Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Joy, if I forget, it was a multi-part question, so if I forget, keep me honest. As far as the desired density, I think we are in a really, really great place after the adoption of Project Recode, because properties that are coming into the city limits that are going to be developed have to come in as a P&D if they're 10 acres or more. Now, if they're just coming in on a singular basis, they have to at least go to N3, and N3 is 15,000 square feet, so we're always going to get that 4 per acre at a minimum. So even if it's not a P&D, we're still meeting that range. Now, I will tell you that as planners, when this range of 4 to 7 was agreed to, we all internally, staff, believe it's low, but that's what the appetite for the taste was, to identify that in 2017 when that was adopted. With the PND, I'd be interested actually to go back and do some calculations and see what our density range is with the PND. I think it would honestly be a good metric of success, and I think it would also help put into perspective, what some of these zones are achieving. I think where we'll have time where we haven't had enough time is in some cases the zoning is there, but the developments are not there yet. So we still can't necessarily count numbers, but I think we can get some ideas for sure. As far as are you talking about a college off of Shiloh?
Yes.
Okay. I actually had some conversations with their engineer at the time, and I'm trying to remember in the way back. They were weighing their options. And I will just say, I won't even speak necessarily to the college. I'll speak to people, just county properties in general, that are kind of on the fence. We hear a lot of feedback that say, it's easier to develop in the county. We want to develop in the county because it's easier to develop. We don't have building permits in the county. We don't have inspections in the county. We don't have this government oversight. And people perceive that as a benefit. And they also perceive it as cost savings. And they say that to us. So that is possibly part of the reason, is because people believe there's a real cost associated with coming into the city. Also in the county, they don't have some of the street maintenance, arterial fees, things like that the city does. So just your cost on your taxes, what you see broken out, changes. So I think people are very aware of those things and just want to be sure that they want to do it before doing so.
Thank you.
Councilmember Boyette?
Thank you, Mayor. You remember me?
Of course.
We spent 10 years together on the zoning commission, and I was always frustrated when one month we would annex a property and the police and fire said no problem. Next month we'd annex some property and the police and fire would say no problem. And that went on. And finally one day I said to Nicole, doesn't anybody look at the whole picture? Because at some point you got a great big pie instead of all these little ones. Well, then in some of our last zonings, I can't remember exactly the phrase, but the police department is saying, yeah, but if we don't get more people, we not know that we can protect it as well as we can now. How do we look at the big picture to say, no, we shouldn't annex anymore because of fire, police, and et cetera, et cetera? How do we, and then comes back to Council Member Owen's question, how do we quantify? Do we have to hold the police department's hand down to the fire and say, can you protect this the best way you can? If not, then we shouldn't annex it.
Councilmember Boyette, that's a good question. It's a question that I've been asked multiple times by a variety of you when I've been, in a public hearing for an annexation. And I think the answer has multiple parts. Police and fire are involved at the annexation policy level in saying, this is where we support map changes and realize that these properties could come in, and this is where, we're unwilling to do so. I have seen police and fire take a stance at the policy level and say, we are not willing to serve this property. In fact, as recent as 2018 or 2019, after the study for the fire came out and saying, here's areas where, you're basically inadequate or you should be concerned for growth. And so they have used those tools to say no at the policy level and to prevent those properties from even coming to you to ask the question in the first place. So they are engaged in that process. Secondly, when it comes down to the individual petitions for annexation, fire and police are unique. Fire is unique especially because of the agreement that the city has with the county for the BUFSA. And I think when it comes to fire, we are better suited to have them in the city and serve them and know how they're being constructed. If they need to have sprinklers, they're getting sprinklers, that, we have that degree of oversight, because we have learned that just not annexing doesn't mean that the property doesn't get developed. So it's still going to be a burden on the fire department. People can and do develop in Yellowstone County and on the edges of the city of Billings, and BUFSA, the Billings Fire Department, is going to serve them regardless of if they annexed or not. So that is unique. It just truly is. And I think that that's where, we try to have those very honest conversations internally where, maybe it's not the ideal property, but what's the outcome? You're going to serve it regardless. So if we can have that property come into the city and then as they make improvements, they're up to code, we're gaining a little bit each time. Police is different because there's not that, reciprocal agreement. Chief St. John has been clear, if it's in the red area, he'll say, I don't want to stand in the way of, these people. And I'm paraphrasing him. And if he's watching, I'm paraphrasing you. I don't want to stand in the way of these people or prevent them from being able to annex, because the reality is they are oftentimes in established beats or patrol routes because of the way that we do have inconsistent borders. And so he tries to point that out. On the ones that occasionally are pretty far out there, he'll say it. And also after the passage of the safety mill levy, I specifically had a conversation with him and said, how do we want to rewrite these? Like, what do you want to say now? And he was like, this doesn't give me a sea of blue. And so it doesn't just mean that we can't continue to acknowledge that just growth over time does require more resources. So
I'm going to follow up on that general theme and then Councilor Ripsis. I'm thinking about metrics that would never go out of style, sort of 30,000 feet things that would be really interesting to know every year from now till the end of time. For example, how many annexations were done this year versus, last year and the year before, and what's the trend there? How many acres were involved? How much is our city growing in percentage terms from year to year? What's our growth rate in population probably for the last year and brought up by census? What's our average density? Are we becoming a more dense city or a less dense city? How do we compare against other comparable cities in that regard? How many dwelling units did we add? How many dwelling units are we short by some sort of standard, whatever it might be? This is kind of the whole pie that Councilmember Boyette was talking about. How many number of schools are overcrowded with some definition? Is that number getting more or less? What's the average response time for our police and fire? It's now about 8 minutes for the fire department. That was in a report we saw the other day. Is that going up or down or what? What's the number of city subdivisions approved this year? Again, long-term number of units in there, and how does that compare against the county? Are we shifting population to the county? Or are we shifting population to the city? How many apartments are being approved? Are we getting more versus single family? Are we getting more single family, more apartments, blah, 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 blah? How many short-term rentals? Are we adding to those based on our new short-term rental registration rules, et cetera, et cetera? And those are just examples. So I know that a lot of that data is already collected and it'll pop up in a annual report from the planning department. But I wonder if we shouldn't be trying to put our head together about a consistent set of matrix that we can know would be in every report or whatever the process would be. So it'd be easy to track from year to year. And we have pretty charts, simple for even simpletons like me to look at, the lines going up or the lines going down, and come up with what those are. And I know, again, you guys collect a lot of that, but I wonder if we don't need to systematize the collection and reporting process on those really important 30,000 foot criteria. That's a comment, but obviously we want to give you and Wyeth an opportunity to respond if you want. And then Councilmember Ripsis, and there was another hand down here, Councilmember Neves.
Mayor Cole, I was thinking maybe you've heard some of Wyeth and I's conversation. You know, we would love to have like a analyst on staff because of the number of inquiries that we get, not only just from say you, but other organizations. You know, they're looking for information that's out there as they're preparing grant applications, or they're looking for funds, or they're trying to justify actions. So I think our most like near term opportunity to put resources towards that is we may be getting a Rocky intern that could be a good fit for. I know the city's going to pilot a program and have been thinking about what they could do for the planning division, and I think that's a great idea. I mean, it is always a heavy lift, the way that all of the data is in so many different places and reports can't easily be generated. You know, it's a very time consuming duty just to come up with like how many new units have been added that are multifamily in this part of town in this year. I mean, you'd think it should be easily able to be recalled, but it's really not that simple. And so, but to your premise of, you know, some metrics that don't go out of style, and as far as, you know, the comments that Councilmember Owen has made, you know, I get it. I hear what you're saying. I do. And one thing that I want to point out is change is sometimes slow, and I do think that change will be slow in the staff reports and in the findings, but not necessarily because I'm not hearing you or I'm not working towards change, but because I can't necessarily get feedback tonight and then change the findings in your next zone change application that I've already gone to the zoning commission. So it might be like, well, I know I talked to Monica about that. Why aren't I seeing any change? And I think each time, you know, it's my goal that we get a little bit better and a little bit better. So I think even in your next set of criteria, you'll see some things that maybe you haven't seen before. It's not a problem solver. That's not all that we're doing, but each time it's my goal to beef them up as we go. So. Okay, thank you, Councilor Ripsis, Neese, and then we should let you move on.
Thank you, Monica. Kind of staying on this concept of metrics. As you know, we've prioritized and budgeted for the cost of services study this year. How do you imagine having that information might affect maybe our criteria for annexation? I know we might not be able to, or probably can't adjust those 10 for zoning, where it might actually be very useful, or is there some flexibility that might be useful or doable as well? But really, how do you see the information coming out of that study being valuable to us during this process? Yeah, thanks for the question, Councilmember Ripsis. I think the study is very valuable and can be. I hope it's a robust study. I hope it comes back with a lot of information. I think when we talk about something like identifying in a policy an ideal density, it should be because we know what it costs, you know, per unit. We have that data, and right now we don't have that data. So, you know, if we find that 4 to 7 is so low, we're going to know how low, like by how much it's low. Whereas right now we just know that planning practice says it should be higher. So I think that's one way. I think also too, as council considers, you know, in the future changes to
zoning and how to use it as a tool to support zone changes that achieve certain densities. You know, it's because you know that there is this cost also associated with that development. I mean, I think it can be one of those reports even that's referred to in our more analytical findings that we hope to get to one day. But I think it's a very useful tool. I have high hopes for it.
Do you foresee that we might have some type of projection during the annexation process of the cost for a particular type of annexation, and then comparing that to maybe the tax revenues that will be generated from that, so we know if the rest of the city will be subsidizing those properties or not?
I don't know if we'll get that alone from the cost of services study. I do think that we can look for opportunities to put some of the burden of identifying some of those revenue projections based on concepts. And a lot of this is going to have to come at the subdivision level, because everything is, I mean, there's so many what ifs at the zoning level. But perhaps being able to get some revenue information that way. It's tough though. That part is tough. But I think understanding the cost is far further along than we have been right now. So it'll be nice to quantify that.
Thank you, Councilmember Bernice, and then back to Monica, and you need to move us on.
I do.
Councilmember Bernice.
Thank you, Mayor. And actually, there's along the same lines that Tom was asking, because one of the things that's always bothered me about the staff memos on these it says something about, financial impact is nothing to the planning department. Well, that's not really where my concern is really the impact to the whole community as far as bringing these properties online. And so what I don't understand is, I do understand the fact that it is difficult, because if you bring in as an N3, you can guesstimate how many homes are going to be on that property, but it's not going to be exact, like you say, until you get down to the subdivision level. But I think there still can be some valuable information there, that if you project that 4 to 7 units per acre or something like that, wherever the density is coming in, or if it's coming in as commercial, you would anticipate what that commercial rate may be on a developed property, and then what those costs of services typically should be for servicing that, because we're servicing property now as it is. And so having some type of estimation of this type of property typically brings in this type of revenue, and the cost of services to service this property will be, X versus Y. And we would know a general amount. And then when we get to the subdivision level approval, we'll know how good was our estimate, and that would help you later on hone those estimates later on down the road. But I think we need to start seeing those on those annexations when they're coming in, and on the subdivision level, so we can actually have a good comparison, really how it impacts. Because one of the questions I get all the time from residents is, we're a growing city, why do we have to keep raising the taxes? And it's because we're developing probably at a negative of cost of services, not covering the cost of services. And we need to be able to see that in our approvals. So when they ask us, we can say, yeah, we just had a bunch of development, it came in, and unfortunately, they're not covering the cost of what the service is going to be, and we need to do something different about it. So
Sure. I will move on after this. I do think that, Councilmember Neese, that we have to be a little bit careful in how you'd potentially arm that information when it's not specific to the criteria. So it is great and good information. It's always good to want to know the financial impacts of something, but it would be something to be conscientious of if trying to use it in that way. So it would be helpful information, but not necessarily direct.
yeah, I think you're right, because often we talk about the potential zoning for annexation, which we can't really talk about making our decision on that zoning. And this would be some things we'd also have to make sure we separate from that approval process. But thank you.
Okay, I am going to move on to the next slide. So, zoning. There were just a couple of questions. One specifically was to just elaborate a little bit about the valid protest and what exactly that means. Basically, I've just put up here what the regulations say, and it's regulations and state statutes, and it's that You have to have 25% of the landowners within a 150-foot range protest. And they can protest at any time. They can protest prior to the zoning commission hearing. They can protest up until the moment this meeting starts. We appreciate when they do it sooner because we have to verify that those are in fact the property owners and that is a valid protest. But all that means is that it then requires you to approve something by 2/3. So it doesn't mean that the project fails. It just means that majority only isn't good enough. You need 2/3. The other way that there's a valid protest is talking about more of a group of lots. So if more than 50% in that area were to protest. But we don't see zone changes like that. We've never seen full-fledged neighborhoods come forward and say, we want to change our zone to this. That's just, we don't see that in practice, but the statutes contemplate it, which is why it's included. Conditions of approval in zone changes. There was a question about, are you sure? Are you sure we can't do conditions? I'm still sure. You can do conditions all day long in subdivision, in special reviews, and in variances. But you cannot do conditions in zone changes. And the reason being is because the statute talks about uniformity. You cannot have the uniformity in your districts if you have conditions of approval for each parcel. And so that is just the simplest way to put it. The only time where we see deviations is through the use of the plan development. And this is not the planned neighborhood development. This is the PD. The plan development, which is a specialized zoning that usually the landowners are asking for, and they're coming up with their own set of unique regulations. We have about like 80 of them in the city. And we've had them for all sorts of number of reasons. We've had people come forward and say, you know, we want to do a PD, but we want to restrict these uses because we don't think they fit in this neighborhood. And so they go through the PD process. 80 PDs are hard to manage. They come with challenges. A lot of them, almost all of them, reference the old zoning code. So not only is staff expected to, you know, get our current zoning code right, but also be able to recall all of the things from the old one. They oftentimes are silent on some issues. They tend to not age well because they were targeted towards specific uses, and those uses change or become irrelevant or just whatever. So that's the only time where we're kind of getting into picking and choosing what's in a district, but it would never be with a standard zone change or within our code. And then there was also a question about how to make neighborhood meetings more productive. And that's, I don't have a great answer for you. We always hope that our developers and our agents are doing the best we can, talking to them, making sure that they understand the importance and significance. But perhaps what I'm learning from feedback that I've gathered is that maybe the public doesn't exactly know like what's next for them or how they can best participate. So something that we've discussed and, you know, are developing conceptually is, you know, how can we get like a how to participate guide to the neighborhood? We are doing postcard mailings now that there's so much information that can just be included based on, you know, a QR code that can get them to this. I think we do a little bit better job with our subdivision notices maybe than we do some of our others because we include the public hearing requirements, the criteria of which they need to speak in those notices, but we could be doing that in zoning. And so I think that, I think this like how to participate guide and getting it to them with the notice is a really good idea. I've gotten some encouragement and it's a good idea. So I think we can look forward to that soon. Oh, any questions on zoning before I move on to subdivision?
Councilmember Boyette, then I have one. Councilmember Boyette.
Thank you, Mayor. One of the things for those 10 years I was on the zoning, we always heard from people who said, I didn't hear about it. I live 163 feet away from the 150 feet. I realize I think we can't be more restrictive than the state, but we can be lenient, more lenient. Could we, the city, change that 150 feet to some arbitrary bigger so that there would be more people that would be aware of it just because they live 153
Sure.
feet away?
Councilmember Boyette, that's actually what we do. So this 150 feet is specific to the valid protest, and that is in state statute, and we cannot change the 150 feet. But we do, and in the adoption of Project Recode, really made some really big notice areas. In fact, it's a 1/4 mile for any property that is adjacent to city limits. And we have done mailings that have been 400 and 500 parcels big. And so I think we've done a good job. I think we've cut down on the number of people that have made that comment significantly in the last couple of years. Don't hear it near as often. So we are doing exactly what you suggested.
Along those lines, our Project Recode includes a minimum sign size. I don't think it changed from the old code. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. This is a bit of a nerdy thing, but when I travel, I note other communities' sign size. And I'm often remark to myself that, boy, that's a really big sign. It really gets your attention. Where ours tend to be kind of, it's a garage sale thing. And assuming we're not stuck with that size, have we thought about just requiring bigger signs? It just gets your attention more, makes it a little harder for people to come up and say, oh, I didn't know, even though there was this significant sign.
Mayor, no, we haven't spent any sort of amount of time talking about it. We try to have really high quality signs. Our street and traffic department makes them and we pay them for them, and they're on like your legit street sign material. They stand the weather well. We're high quality, even if we're not very visible. But I mean, noted, I appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, as those wear out, as long as we're meeting our minimum requirements, I would encourage to look at bigger signs. But go ahead on to zoning. Oh, I'm sorry, there were some other questions down here. Councilmember Rowan, Nice?
Thank you. I think it's great that you're doing a how to participate guide. I really hope that will make a difference. I'd encourage you as you're vetting it or developing it, just to maybe run it through like the adjacent neighborhood committee, just get some of those task force leaders to weigh in on it, since I think they hear a lot about zone changes. But my question is, I think that you and I discussed this, but I'm sorry, I just don't remember the answer to it. There's some sort of process, right, by which council could initiate a zone change. Can you talk about that a little and when that would make sense and how that works?
Sure. So, Councilmember Owen, the code and the statutes do allow for the planning board, the zoning commission, or the governing body to initiate a zone change. An example of this would be, some of you may remember a gymnastics facility over off of Shiloh. And essentially, there was a facility that wasn't allowed in a certain zone, and basically to succeed was going to require a zone change. Well, the neighborhood was not excited about the zone change because of everything else that could come along with it. So what council did in that instance was council initiated a text amendment to include in the neighborhood office zone gymnastics facilities as an allowable use. And that was council initiated after, living through something. That was challenging. I don't know that is the best shining example of when council should do that, because you're making a citywide change based on one property, and unfortunately that it never even developed there, and that one small change had pretty significant cost associated with it, from the time you figure all of the staff hours plus the notice and how all of that was handled. So, we would like to see a bit more substantial things. Not necessarily that we're waiting for the first zoning code amendment for 40 years like before, but we've also had instances where, and I can't remember the specifics, Nicole would be able to recall them, but I believe there was some property in the Heights where, the city council wanted it to be a certain zone and initiated a zone change for it, as opposed to considering the developer's request. But it has to go through the same process. You initiate it. It doesn't mean that you act on it that night. It doesn't mean that you're saying at a council meeting when you're having the public hearing and you're making your decision on an application that you want to change something. it actually goes through the whole process. It's gonna get noticed, the change is gonna be mapped, it's gonna get noticed, it's gonna go for public hearing at the zoning commission. They're gonna make a recommendation and they're gonna bring it back to you. So the initiation process doesn't make the change, it just starts it as if it were its own application.
Thank you, Councilmember Dees.
Yeah, and I can't say this as clear as zoning sign, but the signs that I have seen, I agree with the mayor. I think they need to be bigger. The one I saw, and again, I don't know if it was a zoning change or not. It had to do with changing, maybe it was subdivision change, but small little sign. I drove by it. You could see it in one area, kind of in the bushes there. And if you really looked hard, and the other one was in the dirt, I picked it up and kind of stood. All they were on wood stakes with a little paper and plastic.
Oh, those aren't ours.
Those aren't yours?
Those aren't ours. No, I said we have high quality signs made by Street and Traffic.
So whose signs are those, and can we get those to be?
I could
Or note, so the public can
snap a
actually.
picture with your phone next time.
I think I've got
And-
my director here sometime,
yeah,
and I'll.
because we do have, I mean, we put them together. I know exactly what they're made of. I've put them together myself. But yeah, please send it to me. The only time I could think that something like that could be is if we were out of all of our signs and had no choice but to go that route. But I'm unaware that we've had to do that recently at all.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Mayor, one more question.
Okay.
You mentioned the PDs. Are we not doing the PDs anymore now since they're so difficult to manage? Are we staying away from those?
Councilmember Neese, it's not that we can't do them. It's that developers aren't coming forward and asking to do them. I think the way that the new zoning code is structured is answering and providing a lot of options to developers to not have to do that.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Puritan?
Just a quick question on the protests. In letting the people know that they can protest, but it seems like so many times what they bring to us to protest about is something negligible that we cannot deny that at that point because of what they're wanting. So it kind of puts us in a, rock and a hard space because, yeah, I get the traffic's really bad out there, but, we can't do a traffic study until after the fact. And so I'm just wondering what these protests actually accomplish.
Councilmember Puritan, I think because of exactly the situation that you described is it demonstrates why maybe this how to participate guide could be so important and better utilized by customers. When we've had customers come in the past, we will share with them about criteria. We will give them advice for how to have good, effective public testimony, but it takes those people asking those questions to get that information. So I think that how-to guide could be proactive in giving them something to think about early on.
Monica, my question, then you can move on. I'm sorry to your next topic, but a fundamental problem with zoning that we come across all the time is the fear of the unknown. The zone changes typically in a commercial world, and just as a pure hypothetical example, they want to have a local gymnastics school, which nobody has any great problem with, probably. But because of the zoning, community commercial in those days could allow a casino. You get this parade of horribles, which are unlikely, but still theoretically possible. That seems like it's really the tail wagging the dog when we make decisions based on small possibilities that are highly unlikely. But we do it anyway, and we kind of have to, and I understand that. I'm wondering if there isn't legal room for us to do one of two things. One, to, on a broad basis, require that people be bound, identify the actual use, and be bound by that for a period of time. As a practical matter, realtors are going to hate that because they're always trying to prepare a property for sale. Changing the zoning is a big part of it. They may not have a specific buyer in place. So they would hate that as a practical matter. I get that. The next best thing, though, would be perhaps to allow for a waiver, a legally binding waiver of the right to develop certain types of property. So if there are 30 proper uses, but it's obvious that there's one, call it a casino, that's a real problem area, why couldn't we enter into a binding waiver for a period of 5, 10, 20 years, whatever, where they would say, we're going to maintain our right to do the other 29, but we're going to waive our right to do problem area, number 30. And they're stuck by that. They're bound by that. But it makes everybody a lot happier. So you want to comment on our legal ability to do that? And if the question is not sure, I think we might want to look into that sometime.
Sure. I'm not sure about the legal aspect of it. I can say from a planning principles aspect of it, it's a terrible idea. and the reason being is because truly, zoning ordinances should be comprehensive, and that use table, if there is a zone district, community commercial was a shining example of a terrible district. It included everything from residential homes all the way up to casinos to almost like sub-industrial uses. And it was too big. I would like to think that we have made tons of strides with Recode, because we now do not have community commercial. Now we have several different commercial districts, all of which the use table is very different from district to district to specifically try to tailor those uses. So I think that we have some just a success at the fact that it's been a long time since we've had a casino come before you that has caused a lot of consternation and a lot of difficulty in a public hearing situation. So before you consider the waiver route, I would consider what can you do in the use table, and how could you maybe initiate a zone change or a text amendment to the use table to make the use table more appropriate than to one off these properties. Because I think you also have to realize the position that you're asking that landowner at that point in time to be in. He may not be the landowner, or she may not be the landowner in a year. Maybe they just want to entitle it and sell it. Those are all very real scenarios that happen. And when you start one-offing things, it really changes the entitlement process of that property.
Okay,
So
to be carried on, Ken, on that topic or something short, and then again, we need to move on.
Thank you. Just real quick, Monica, when you send that letter of notification out to the people within 300 feet, I think you also send it to the neighborhood task force chairs in that area. Could you possibly send that to us, either paper or email or something? A lot of times those people will call us with questions about that, and we don't even know what they're talking about because it's so far out. We don't have any, and I understand we need to be careful about what we're talking about, but it would be helpful just to know what they're looking at.
Councilmember Rupsis, what I'd actually like to do instead is send you guys an email that has a link to our current applications website, because that's going to be updated every time, every month, and it's a consistent website that never changes. And so that'd be a great place to direct people to if they're saying, oh, I heard about this. Do you know if there's an application?
Okay.
So,
all right, that'd be
yeah.
fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, subdivision. Okay, how are neighbors informed of findings of fact? The best way that I could answer this is that our surrounding property owner notice in subdivisions, which is required to be certified mail by state statute in subdivision, includes on the back side the subdivision criteria for which it is to be approved. And so that is how they are made aware of that. And then additionally, in our planning board room, we actually have on a foam board on the wall those criteria so that people can reference them throughout the meeting. If anybody were to ask for the application, the staff report, we of course provide them with all of that information. But that is my answer to that question. Moving on, how are neighborhood concerns incorporated? Typically, they're incorporated through a condition of approval. With major subdivisions, sometimes there are items that are brought up at the planning board level where a concern can be mitigated through a condition, and the planning board will make a recommendation to amend it. Sometimes we hear things from property owners before we're putting staff reports together, and of course we try to understand if that's a warranted or maybe do some fact checking to see if that's something to be incorporated. And so that does happen at the planning board level from time to time when there's a lot of interest. Number 3, what are the notice requirements and can they be expanded? So our regulations mirror state statute, and it says that adjoining property owners for subdivision shall be noticed by certified mail. We could increase this range if we wanted to. It could be 300 feet, it could be more, but right now our regulations mirror state law, and we're not prohibited from making it larger. Parkland, there were some questions specifically about some certain citations included there on the screen. Coordination of cash in lieu versus land is kind of the nature of these citations here. We do have to give due weight and consideration to the subdivider, but that doesn't mean that we have to take what the subdivider wants as the only option. So let's break this down and let's start with the first one, which is subsection 2. This basically talks about how the city could have the ability to, through the growth policy, identify a different means of collecting a different mathematical way of identifying how much land is required to be developed. I ran some quick numbers just using a development that's happening this year, and on a more single family type of development, if we used the maximum, which is identified as 0.03 acres per dwelling unit, we actually fall short of what the 11% adds up to. I think where there's the most like unrealized gains by a potential strategy of using this is more in our multifamily developments, because we're counting by dwelling unit as opposed to acre size. So it is something that is enabled by state statute. We don't have anything in our growth policy where we identify a rate like this. It's not to say it can't be included, because it could. But just for perspective, and I was curious too when I ran the numbers, but for single family, it actually would be a little bit disadvantaged. And then secondly, subsection 4 basically talks about this process where council, the planning board, staff, and the developer have more coordination than just this is the developer's preference. One of the questions specifically was, could there be a policy that identified areas of town where the city's preference is to see cash versus the city's preference is to see land? And absolutely, I don't see any problem with that whatsoever, the way that the statutes are written. We don't have anything like that in place right now. It'd be a great idea. I think it could be structured similarly, honestly, to the annexation policy. I mean, it's a simple 1-2 page policy with a map, and we can give that to all of our developers, and we can rely on it in pre-application meetings and make sure to see outcomes that way. So I think that's a great opportunity for us. And I think also too, because we are in the process of rewriting certain portions of the city subdivision regulations, that this is something that we as staff could even kind of kick around and further refine what the bones of that could look like. And it's a great way to influence outcomes, because it is policy level and it's not one subdivision at a time playing by different rules. So I think there's great opportunity in that. And then basically a general question of how to advocate for better parkland and new developments. I think a tool like that we just discussed is ideal. I think us as staff advocating early on for our needs and being tougher with our developers is also an opportunity that we can do better at. And then I also think that there are some policy changes coming your way. One of the things that I think we're finding is maybe in the P&D, the 2% open space is not enough. We have to start somewhere. I think we're finding that 2% isn't enough. So we do have plans to bring forward zoning code amendments this winter, spring, that are not those housekeeping amendments, but a few more substantive things, the things that we've been monitoring from several of our stakeholders. And it could be sooner than that, but we're working on a lot of things and a lot of policy things. And so I think that 2%, not forgetting to consider increasing that, is a great way to advocate for better parkland. And that 2% is required by the zoning code to be developed. So, sometimes land it just sits more like open space. So that's also, in my opinion, quality open space, is that it's required to be developed by the zoning. I also think in our subdivision regulation amendments, you'll see that Parks is using their comprehensive plan that was adopted a few years ago, and implementing and proposing things directly out of that plan, and getting clearer about suitable parkland, characteristics of suitable parkland. It's not just your swamp. You know, it's not just where you're holding your stormwater. So I think having clear guidelines. You know, we have guidelines for what our roads need to be, for other infrastructure. Why not this? So you will definitely be seeing that. Any questions about subdivision before I move on?
And I'm going to start on that one. The park dedication, this is really, I think, really important. We have a fundamental problem in that we don't have a way to acquire large tracts of land for large regional parks. The way the formula works is you have to set aside about 10%, unless it's cash in lieu, call it 11%. And the Parks Department would say that a large regional park is about 40 acres. So if you do the math, you need around 400 acres to get 40 acres of parkland. A 400 acre subdivision is roughly three quarters, or not 3/4, about 2/3 of a square mile. Those are scarcer than hen's teeth. So, but that's what we're dependent upon to get a large regional park in that mechanism. As a result, I don't know that's ever happened, ever, in the history of Billings, that we've ever had a large regional park created that way. But it may have, but it's very, very rare. So it seems to me, though, that if that's what we've got, we need to look at a system maybe where a developer might have a large tract of property, maybe not 400 acres, but very large, and where they would be interested in having a large regional park right next to that property, but they certainly don't have any obligation to donate 40 acres of it, or whatever the number might be. And so I'm wondering if we couldn't start developing a plan where we encourage those kind of projects to set aside a much larger piece of property in exchange for giving the city an option to acquire additional parts of that property over time using cash in lieu dollars as they come in, or donations, or surplus reserve money, or pennies from heaven, whatever the city might have. But over time, we would have the option in stages. And if we didn't meet our deadlines, it goes back to the developer can sell it, whatever. But we have an opportunity to do that. And the developers wouldn't have any obligation unless maybe we created regulations requiring it. But that might be some way, and maybe not just 400 acres, but anything over 5 acres. Even if the Parks Department would say that a minimum size for a programmable park is 5 acres, but that's still a 50-acre subdivision. And that's a big subdivision, 50 acres. So anywhere between that 5 acres and 40 acres, you know, we could maybe acquire land on the installment plan, I guess I'd call it. Anyway, I saw lots of other hands. Councilmembers Boyette, Owen, and Gulick.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm opposed to these great big parks because we don't seem to take care of them in the future. But every time I go for a ride, I drive through these giant army barracks, giant apartments that we're building on the west end, and I see the kids playing on the street because there's not a little park. My thought is, why build a park 5 blocks away, 10 blocks away? Can we somehow make the developers build smaller parks within their own development? That would be my ultimate goal. You know, instead of having the kids play on the street and have to get in the car and drive to a park. I grew up with a park. We didn't have a park. We played on the grounds around the houses. Is there any way we can require, or at least look at, these big developments having something inside their area where the kids can play? That's just mine.
Councilmember Boyette, that's a tough situation. Parks has plans and priorities, and what they've identified is what's programmable space, what can be used how they, because I don't have parks expertise. I mean, I'm not standing before you as a parks planner, but basically how the parks department says, okay, a minimum, we need X number of acres. You know, some of the stuff that's coming forward in our P&Ds is not big enough for parks to care about, but it's very vital that 2% was included in that development. And so I think what you're describing is your desired outcome. Actually, there is a conflict between parks, how parks is administering and managing and handling parks, and what their plans say. It's not a staff thing. They're all being guided in their decisions based on their plans. But we have run into the situation like I've just described. Somebody will propose parkland that's too small, and parks might say, well, we don't want to take that as a public park. You need to privately maintain it. So what your desired outcome isn't really supported by policies and plans right now, but not to say we can't get there. And I'll certainly make sure that I have parks listen to this part of the presentation, because I think they need to hear and also be able to respond for my lack of response.
Councilor Rowan, I think, and Gulick.
Thanks, Mayor. When we're looking there, Monica, at item 4.2, a policy identifying the geographic areas where there would be land or cash in lieu, you had suggested what I think was a standalone policy. If it were incorporated into the growth policy, so the council were at least looking at it every 5 years, do you think that would create too much chaos in the planning process, or would that be an appropriate amount of time to say, you know what, we've really done better here, or we need to balance here? Is that an okay framework from a planning perspective to be revisiting such a policy?
Councilmember Owen, first thoughts are, I think it would be better as a standalone policy because it's so simple. Or it could be so simple. In my mind, it doesn't have to be something that's overly complicated. Just like, I mean, yes, we haven't looked at the growth policy since 2017, but we haven't looked at the growth policy, or at the annexation policy since 2017, but we haven't looked at the growth policy since 2016. And I think the growth policy, because not that it doesn't include community facilities and quality of life and things like that it couldn't be included, but I think we could get it implemented faster if it was a standalone process and then maybe integrated to the growth policy afterwards. Because I will tell you that, you know, we do need to get the growth policy on our radar. We think a lot of the growth policy, an update is not a comprehensive update of it. And so I think if this is something that council feels strongly about and wants to get moving on quickly, I think your best opportunity is to handle it alone at first, and then see about aggregating it into the growth policy.
But conceptually, looking at that policy every 5 years doesn't sort of red flag to you as that's too fast or too slow? Okay, thank you.
Councilor Gulick?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm glad to hear that the 2%, back to the Parkland with the P&Ds and the 2% minimum, I was glad to hear that was programmable space. I guess when we dealt with the timbers, I was kind of thinking that a lot of that was sort of creek bottom area and or just a strip along the trail. And so I think that is really good, but that particular subdivision also raised the question of, you know, they're large N3 lots, and, you know, I think the demand for parks land probably is less than it would be next to NX3 or something like that, where there is a real requirement. So I could see adding even more complexity, but being more appropriate, I guess, if we were to do so. And I think as just a sort of general statement, I'm sort of more pro expansion of the quality in our parks rather than the quantity. But I recognize there's new areas we're building, and we need to have parks nearby there as well. But I think I just see a lot of land that's not highly programmed, and there's a lot of good open space, which I think is great to have. But of the spaces that are programmed, I think dedicating more money for those rather than just increasing the acreage would be good. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Tricky, and then, or I'm sorry, Councilmember Tricky, Neese, and then are we going to wrap up? Are we about done here? So Councilmember Tricky.
I actually agree with both Councilmember Boyette and the mayor. And I guess my question, or where I would like to see us go, is to see if we can't pull together a policy where we can be more intentional about where our parks are going. Thank you. She nodded for the audience.
Okay. Well, that's a commitment. That's a deal then.
If there is a question there, I'm happy to try to answer, but I think we all agree that quality, location, there's a lot of information that we have where we could be guiding better development decisions related to parks, is what I'm hearing consistently.
Okay, Councilmember Neese?
Thank you, Mayor. So this is interesting about the 0.03 acres per dwelling unit, and I agree with what Councilman Gulick said about, if you have an N3 property, you really don't tend to need a park, especially for the large acreage versus, NX3. And so that's one of the things I think during the RECO that I mentioned early on was I think when we have these larger NX3 developments, we need to make sure we have more open, I think it's open space, not so much parkland. And so I want to clarify, is that there's this 2%, that's parkland, not just open space requirement, is that correct?
Yeah, it's the P1 designation, so or the P1 zone district, which is park.
Yeah, but they do require separate open space requirements as well. Do I understand that these are not always the same?
The requirements in subdivision are different than the 2% in P&D, but the 2% from the P&D contributes to the 11 or 7.5 or 5 or 2.5% in the subdivision. Am I missing your question here?
Yeah, so what's the difference between open space and parkland and parks?
Okay, so I think maybe you're talking developed parkland versus just land that's set aside that isn't improved.
Because don't we have some requirements for open space, open land? Or open space?
So in the zoning code, there is an allowance for open space that preserves a natural area that is contributing in some way. So you couldn't just be like, oh, that's the swamp over there, that's my open space. It should be a natural area that can still be enhanced as an amenity. So for instance, in the Timbers, a trail that follows the creek to get people down there and connect them. So, but we, the zoning 2% says you have to, develop these.
Develop 2%.
Versus in parkland, they can plan to develop it and maintain it through a PMD, or sometimes it remains open space. And I would have to ask Parks exactly what that threshold is, because I do not know that.
Okay, because I think if we were to change it to, and I'm assuming we're not doing it per dwelling unit now, correct?
We're not.
Yeah, and I think when you said you looked at, if I understood correctly, the NX or the N properties, typically we would actually probably be less parkland in that area, but in the NX property, we would actually have more parkland. And I think that's actually what we need, because you have a higher density of population. That goes back to what Councilman Boyette mentioned about having, with these high density properties having this. So I would consider that's taking a look seriously at this per dwelling unit versus what we're doing now, because I'm not so sure it's really providing what we need as a community.
Right. And actually, Councilmember Neese, I'm glad that you brought up the 0.03, because I actually think, Councilmember Owen, I thought you were asking me about 4, which is the land and cash and lieu. Your last answer where you were asking about the growth policy, and I'm telling you, oh, you should do this as a standalone thing.
Yes, I was asking about 4.2. So a policy identifying the preference of geographic areas.
Okay, all right. Now I've just confused myself. So great, perfect. I
think
did
your
answer your question.
Totally on point.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. I was like, I think I was
Okay,
thinking.
Councilmember Neese?
One more question. It has to do with what you brought up about the large parks. And my question.
Well, in that case, go ahead.
Yeah. My question is, I think he's right in the fact that if you're developing smaller developments all the time, you never actually get to that regional park if you need it. Is there any way that we, not necessarily having to set aside the land, but having these developments coming in to contribute towards a regional park, if it's outside of a regional park area, that this is an area that once you bring it in, yes, you still have your whatever requirement for your parkland, but you also have to contribute to, the regional park area, that this is an area that once you bring it in, yes, you still have your whatever requirement for your parkland, but you also have to contribute to, the regional park area, that this is an area that once you bring it in, yes, you still have your whatever requirement for your parkland, but you also have to contribute to, the regional park area, that this is an area that once you bring it in, yes, you still have your whatever requirement for your parkland, but you also have to contribute to, the regional park area, that this is an area that once you bring it in, yes, you still have your whatever requirement for your parkland, but you also have to contribute to, the regional park area, that this is an area that once you bring it in, yes, you still have your whatever requirement for your parkland, but you also have to contribute to, the regional park area, that this is an area that once you bring it in, yes, you still have your whatever requirement for your parkland, but you also have to contribute to, the regional park area, that this is an area that once you bring it in, yes, this regional park that's going to be in this area that doesn't have a regional park. So if you think about what the distance we need between regional parks is, you're in that zone. If you're annexed in, you have to now contribute towards this regional park that's going to be developed someday in the future.
Councilmember Neese, it's something to look into. At first blush, it kind of sounds a little bit like double dipping. You know, the statutes require that developer provide cash in lieu for their development. But however, I think you can't get land in their development and cash towards a regional park. I think if we're thinking of what a policy could look like where there is, you know, a geographic area or maybe these regions where it's like cash is preferred here, it's probably because that cash may be to acquire the funds to, you know, to get a property that could serve as a regional park. So I think that's more of the way, but what you described is like, well, do some in your development and then also pay over here towards this.
Yeah,
that I think is harder.
Yeah, don't want to double dip.
Councilmember Joy, and then Monica, do you have
I'm trying.
anything after subdivision though? I mean, do you have anything after subdivision?
I have one, I just have one more topic area.
Okay, Councilmember Joy, and then it's all yours.
Thank you, Mayor. Could you tell me how much of the city of Billings is zoned N3 as a percentage? Do you know that?
I do not, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Monica.
Okay. Applying the growth policy. So we briefly talked about this on the first slide, but there was a question about this. And so growth policies are designed, just as you described earlier, Mayor, they're kind of these fuzzy, abstract, you know, feel good documents that are not regulatory. They provide a vision. They are a high level document that does not regulate. And so strict compliance with a growth policy would never result in a denial. Because it's very hard to measure a growth policy. It's very hard to measure compliance with it. It is not a checklist, and it shouldn't be a checklist. It's not a point system. It's not, you know, you get 20 points because you really hit the nail on the head with community fabric. Like, that's not how it works. So essentially, when we're applying the growth policy, we are looking for the ways in which the growth policy supports the application at hand. And then compare those broad statements, draw what we can out of them, and elaborate on them in the staff report. But there is not a scientific way to drill down and filter it down and say it scored a 79 in compliance with the growth policy. And that's really not how a growth policy is intended to be used. That's all I have to share on applying the growth policy.
Okay, Councilmember Boyette.
Thank you. You're the first one that's ever agreed with me. The growth policy is just a giant wish list that a bunch of people said, if the world was perfect, we would like this.
Oh, now you're putting words in my mouth, Councilmember Boyette.
But
remember, I'm a planner.
Yeah, but that's what it comes down to. And they say, well, it complies with the growth policy. Well, if I put 10 people in a room and say, give me the best ideas in the whole world, that's the growth policy. I've read it. It's kind of a utopia. So I'm glad that you said that we don't say this is perfect, this if it has to meet the growth policy. Thank you.
Councilmember Ripsis, Councilmember Neese.
Thank you, Mayor. Monica, going back to the cost of services study, would the growth policy be an appropriate location to say something like, given all this 5-10 years down the road when we've got all our stuff together, given that we now have data and comfortable feeling with where we are related to our cost of services and the revenues that we expect to bring in related to those, would the growth policy be an appropriate place to say, you know what, we prefer growth that will pay for itself?
Absolutely. And that kind of broad statement is the type of broad statement that you'll find in a growth policy and that is appropriate for a growth policy. We don't have anything like that in there yet. We have some things that allude to, you know, being responsible, fiscally responsible, but nothing that we could tie back to the policy like that or to a plan like that.
Councilmember Neese, and then we'll look to wrap this item up.
Thank you, Mayor. Monica, this one, I always look at this and I always think of this as the same as, you know, finding the facts. I mean, these are really opinions of how you interpret the policy and how it's going to fit the project. One of the things I would always appreciate if we could ever get this done is not just how this may fit the growth policy, but how it doesn't fit the growth policy. So we can weigh the options to know really what's the good and the bad about it. Otherwise, you know, for us to go through and you guys are the experts to interpret the growth policy based upon the project. And I think you guys have a better idea of what you feel where it doesn't fit. And it may not fit in a certain area, but maybe it really, in this particular reason, it doesn't matter. But at least we know it didn't fit here, and that, or maybe it is an important area that we need to know about. So it would be helpful to have the pros and the cons. But thank you.
Okay, Councilor Tricky, Councilor Purinton.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So just like I was saying, how can we be intentional with parks? You know, the Billings Bypass Corridor Study just is in its final stages right now. And as we look at that development there, that just begs the question, how can we be intentional about how that area is developed? I mean, one of the things they asked for is like a town center type of thing. What can we be doing in order to encourage something like that to happen up there?
Sure, Councilmember Chiriki. In growth policies, you can employ certain tools like a future land use map that can be used, and that's a clear way that we can say, you know, this is the use that was identified in the future land use map, and what you're proposing is inconsistent with that map. A lot of jurisdictions have future land use maps included in their growth policies. In fact, the county commissioners today just were made aware of an application that is consistent with the future land use of the Lockwood growth policy. So there are things that we could do to utilize certain tools like that in the growth policy to make it more intentional. I think definitely our corridors, you know, we've been so fortunate with our MPO funds to have some really amazing studies done, but they have to be more engineering type as opposed to planning. MDT won't fund planning activities like that, but yeah, I think there's room to utilize tools in the growth policy for that.
Look forward to it.
Yeah.
Okay, Councilmember Purinton.
So I guess in conjunction with that, you know, there was quite a concern about Highway 3, the development up there, and how that can be a type of corridor coming from the west side on Highway 3. And even with the Billings bypass, you know, I agree with that. To be intentional, and how do we do that? How do we limit, you know, the commercial, the industrial, the residential? How do we say this is what we want in that area? And so this is where I get on kind of hammering this growth policy, is because it is to be reviewed every 5 years. And it's my understanding now that pretty much the staff reviews it. But the growth policy, my understanding is how our citizens want Billings to look like, or how they want it to grow. And so staff recommendations on, you know, where that growth policy is going, to me, is not how the citizens may want the community to look. So how do we engage? And I know it's difficult to get community engagement, but even if we did it through our boards and our neighborhood task force, and then open it up to the public, and I know it's probably laborious and challenging at the very least every 5 years to get these people to come together and say, well, this is what we want, or we didn't like that, so what are we going to make it look like here, there, and yonder? So how do you balance that? How do you balance that with having community involvement in a growth policy if the staff is the one that is primarily driving the growth policy?
Councilmember Purinton, I mean, I think you have a very conscientious staff that is listening always, from the things that, you know, council is providing as well as the things that the public is providing. And I would say even in this discussion, it has helped, I think, get a pulse on some things that we don't get to talk about at the application level. And so, I mean, we are always monitoring things. We're always getting feedback from things. As far as the growth policy, in the same, it is important to have a vision. I think the vision for the city of Billings has dramatically changed based on how broad and vague the growth policy can be. I don't think we've changed dramatically in 5 years. I think if we had some real shining examples of where the growth policy has created these impossible situations, that would be an indicator that the growth policy is not working, in its intended way. But that's not to say that we can't and don't have the ability to do some community outreach where, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. The things that we've talked about today, the fact that we are working on subdivision regulations, we are working on a lot of things, and we can't do them all. And that's kind of what this conversation has started to feel like to this point is, how do we do it all? And the answer is we don't do it all, and that's why it's 2022 and the growth policy is 5 years, and we're not talking about it at the council level yet. Because if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. So, not a good answer, but I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, council. Thank you very much, Gina. We do have to have an opportunity for public comment.
Hang on.
Okay, and then it looks like we do have somebody online. But go ahead.
Okay, so wrapping up, we're all land use experts now, and
You got your planning joke in.
and I'm so grateful, that we've had this specific time. But in all seriousness, I do think that there is a baseline understanding of the multiple processes that we have. I think that you have the opportunity. Good thing I have them in front of me. That you have the opportunity to be policy focused moving forward. It's okay. I'm prepared. Specifically, we have a draft, a draft that we're working on of subdivision regulations. There will be a process for you to participate at the policy level, and ultimately you will be asked to approve those after planning board consideration. So that is something that is coming up this fall and this winter in a way that you can influence policy related to development. Also, zoning code amendments. We have items that we've been monitoring, feedback that we've gotten back from other groups. We are researching, coming up with a starting point of having those conversations with those stakeholders. Look for that this winter and spring. Support the cost of services study, keep it moving. Obviously, we're glad to have funding for it, but those are ways, help advocate with parks for a policy like we just discussed as far as geographic area. Those are ways that I would encourage you to be involved, because that is what will trickle down to the individual subdivisions that you see. And then we will keep doing work on our end to make improvements, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Monica. Is there anybody present who would like to make public comment at this time? No, but there is somebody online, I believe. Kevin, can you introduce that person?
Go ahead, John.
All right, it's John Halverson online, per usual. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council. I appreciate the conversation. So important to have these conversations. I just want to touch back on a few items that have been discussed. On the item of, when county subdivisions, when their water systems fail, and those subdivisions have to be annexed into the city and, served with water and served by police and all of our city services, that cost is going to be astronomical. There's a reason that we don't annex those developments into the city when they're originally built. And it's because of all the miles and miles of sewer and water, and the miles and miles that all of our departments will have to drive, which is, not only capital costs, but also FTE in terms of time. So when that time comes, when those systems fail, when the water table drops, it's going to amount to a massive bailout of county residents who, are now in many ways free riders who drive on our roads and externalize the true cost of that development. And the fact of the matter is that when DEQ looks at those county developments, it's only looking at them one-off in a vacuum. It's not looking at our whole situation in the Yellowstone Valley. So, when it comes time for those to be annexed, that is going to be, I don't envy anyone who's on council at that time, because that's going to be extremely costly. And, the city residents are going to be providing a bailout to some pretty wealthy county residents. And then on the topic of parks, I'll just touch on this briefly. I'm running out of time here, but you know, parks that children can walk to are, I think, much more valuable than a regional park. You know, a 40-acre park with a 100-stall parking lot is something. You can get 4 baseball fields and, you know, a bunch of regulation-sized soccer fields, but no child will ever be able to walk to it. So, you know, let's think about small parks. A programmable park that has a, you know, a regulation soccer field that is, you know, 5 miles away across a dangerous arterial is not as valuable to a family as a small park that's right there. So thank you for your time and for your consideration.
Thank you very much. Is there any other public comment on this item? No, there isn't, so we'll close the public comment period. Just as we leave here, I'll just commend council and staff. I think this was a great discussion. These are the sorts of high-level discussions that work sessions are made for, I think. So that's just great. My comment about the parks discussion, though, is that we wouldn't be having this discussion about where to put sewer and water without having public works in the room. And so we don't have the Parks Department in the room. And that's a fundamental missing element, I guess. So just want to underline that kind of obvious point. So we're going to take a break now, but Gina, I'm just going to ask you to give some thought or tell us right now. The next item really has 3 separate elements. The council committee's resolution, the council members Owen and Shaw worked on, the meeting ordinance rewrite that you worked on, and then the remote attendance resolution that you worked on. They're all kind of in the same area, but not strictly connected to each other. So one question will be, how do you propose that we go through those? Is there a logic to the order, or does it not matter? You can comment now or when we come back, but what do you think?
Mayor, I'm happy to comment now. This agenda item was really thrown on at the last minute, so it's a true information or informal type of work session agenda item. There's no presentation. We can go at this however you would like. We just need feedback how you guys want staff to go forward on these items, so we can take it however council wants to take it.
Okay, well, we'll discuss that when we come back. It is 7:32. Let's start no later than 7:40, which would be 8 minutes, and if we can start before then, all the better. We're adjourned for the time being. Okay, welcome back, everybody. During the break, had a little bit of a discussion about how to proceed with these next three items in number 2. And the thought was that because some of these items may end up being referred to one of the committees, the council subcommittees, if we agree to go in that direction, that will be relevant to the other 2 items. And so I guess what my proposal would be, unless council felt differently, would be to start with the discussion about council's committees. And so we'll go in that direction. I see some nodding heads, but I'm going to turn it to Gina to give introduction any way she'd like. Her staff memo did show some of the research on the issue of council committees generally. So that might be a good place for you to start, Gina, and you can comment specifically and as much as you want on any of the others. But let's start there, and then we'll come back to the issue of the rewrite of our council rules that are in the ordinance, and then also remote attendance, but we'll do that later. So go ahead, Gina.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Like I said earlier, I don't have a presentation, and so this is really just a follow-up to our August 1st work session where we discussed the ordinance to revisit, revamp, and modify the rules of procedure and order of business. To the staff memo for tonight, I just attached the previous versions. I know that there were some edits and some suggestions after the last work session, but I didn't incorporate anything in there yet until I had everybody's feedback. So that's why you're seeing the same drafts attached to the staff memo tonight. But as I understand it, that particular issue may get referred to the committee. So as you suggested, it seems most appropriate to discuss the subcommittee or the standing committee issue first and determine how council wants to proceed on that issue. If you want to have a more formal procedure as it's been suggested, I think that that's kind of the consensus here is a formal resolution to establish these committees, to establish their scope and their purpose and the term of those committees, and which you don't have to do. If you wanted a little bit more informal committees, those could just be established at a regular business meeting. You can appoint members, but the resolution's absolutely appropriate, and that's attached to the staff memo as well that you have. So I think if you address that first, that may very well expedite the rest of this meeting, because the standing committee, the rules of the local government committee, I think it would be, whichever one it is, local operations. I can't remember the committees that you all have established, but if you council operations, thank you, Councilmember Shaw. If you throw this issue to that committee, then that committee can work on it, and I can certainly be the staff person liaison to assist with that issue, and we can address that outside of a work session. And that's really all I have. Unless you have any questions for me about procedure or what I've got in the staff memo.
Okay, well, let's just jump into then the Standing Council Committee's proposed resolution. Here I'd like to hear from Council Members Owen and Shaw to give their overview and ask how you think that we should proceed with the further discussion to dig into this one. So whichever you'd like to start.
Sure, I'll start. Okay. So hasn't changed significantly from the last time we brought it forward, but we did put a lot more teeth on it so that we tried to really flesh out some more of the details and answer some of the questions people had, like we don't think 2 council members from the same ward should serve on the same committee, for example, and a few more things like that. And we tried to kind of give a good scope for what each of these committees would really do. I think the questions we still have, other than do we want to adopt these or not, is some of the composition of some of the committees of, do we want these committees to be open to other members sitting on the committee? For example, like the legislative one. Are we going to be asking legislators to sit on the committee? Is this just a council committee that they participate in, or kind of what does that look like? And also the local affairs committee with the school board and the county. We've kind of talked through some of how we think that could work, but I think that's also a bigger question for council of, and it would depend on how we establish the committee of if we have people actually sitting on them versus being invited to participate. So I think we need to flesh those things out if the answer is yes, we want to move forward. But certainly from my perspective of if we decide we want to establish these committees and move forward with the council operations, the rest of the meeting that's on our agenda for tonight goes to that committee to flesh out and then come back to us. That's sort of the focus of that committee, is to deal with all of the council operational issues, changing, any of that big stuff that we don't have to do that right now tonight. So the overview is that I think we've tried really hard to come up with a structure that we think could work, to try it out. Both Jennifer and I feel like we want to go through the formal resolution process just because we think it needs to be a formal committee. I think we can obviously do it less formally, but I think it will have a longer longevity if we actually put a resolution behind it. So that's hence the drafting. So Jennifer, I throw it to you.
Sure, thanks. So I think from my perspective, this presents a real opportunity for us to do better as council members. But I also would just encourage all my colleagues up here to think about the facts, about the distinctions between what these committees will do and what we as a sort of committee of the whole, as a full council would do. So in theory, every council member would sit on one committee for 2 years, except for this first committee where we're getting everything established. It'll be a shorter term. And then there's a leadership committee of the mayor, deputy mayor, and mayor pro tem. But this would give each council member for a period of 2 years a chance to focus on a thing. But keep in mind that as you look at these scopes, they're predominantly about process, about quality, and about vetting, not about the ultimate policy decisions, because those remain here at council. So it's easy for me as a council member to say, but I care about all of these things. And of course we do. And the decisions remain here at council. But the committees can focus more on how the budget gets developed and presented to council. Or, are we tracking every bill that could have an impact on the city of Billings? And does council need to have an opinion about it? So I know the impulse is going to be for some of us to say, I want to do all of these things and I can't specialize. But I think if we give this a try, we will find there's real value in being a little more disciplined in the preliminary stages of vetting policy concepts. I would also note that I did a little bit of research in other sort of peer cities, cities of our size, and it is not uncommon for councils to have these sort of standing committees. And in fact, in some cases, the language in here parallels what I've seen in other cities. The city of Missoula has many, many more committees than this. There are, but I've looked at other municipalities about our size. So what I tried to do, and what I think Kendra and I tried to do as we put these scopes in here, is to stay pretty consistent with what we see other policy-making bodies do. These are appropriate things for a smaller committee to work on versus decisions that remain here at the council. So the general idea would be that you would serve on 2 committees during your term of office. 1 year you do a turn on the legislative committee, because we kind of think that's the committee that could be the most sensitive. So it's the one that requires most balance among us as council members. And then you'd have your choice for the other one of either working on budget or our local affairs issues. I would just note that I think when we were drafting the scope of the local affairs committee, so that joint committee between the 3 entities, that we inadvertently left out emergency planning, continuity of government, some of those sort of things where we really have a shared interest. I think that should be added in. It's something that we sort of overlooked in the drafting process. So I would ask you to consider that as a potential amendment before we vote. Otherwise, I would just really recommend this to you all. I think we have an opportunity here to do something really meaningful in the way that we think about policymaking on this council. And I think it'll feel uncomfortable for a while, but I think at least this first, 14 months would be a really good learning experience for us. So like Kendra, I assume we're happy to answer any questions, but this is kind of what we recommend to you after quite a bit of discussion.
Okay, thank you. Let's try to focus on kind of questions as much as we can. And we'll get into more kind of the bottom line here in a bit. Councilmembers Boyette and Gulick and Neese.
Thank you, Mayor. One of the things that really bothered me when I first signed on here was the lack of this. We were just kind of thrown to the wolves and we're kind of wandering around. I like having some control and saying, look, we want you to be on this committee and this committee, and it gives me a focus of what to do. So I was really disappointed coming in that we didn't have this. So I wholeheartedly support that everybody gets to do something, and we want you to be part of the organization and give your input. I think this is great. Thank you.
It's my favorite kind of question. Yes.
Yeah. Councilmember Gulick.
I'll also eat praise very briefly, but then I would actually make comment more than a question. It was brought up with the legislative committee. I'm not sure what the composition in terms of our legislators, do they have seats on it? I think I would recommend that that not be the case. We can organize ourselves. I don't think we can organize others. What if other legislators, volunteered to sit on it? I don't want to hamstring us and our ability to put together a slate of legislation that we'd like to see advanced, as well as just, to organize the interface with different legislators. So anyhow, that's my only 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Neese.
Thank you, Mayor. I will hold my comments and just questions like it was told to ask. Okay, so question about section.
And we're not going to enforce that religiously.
Okay, well then I'll say I'm fully behind this. But, so my question about it is, because I want to make sure the details are correct on this. When we look at, where did it go? Sorry, item number 4. And it's not going to affect us today, but I always like to think, down the road, no 2 council members of the same ward sit on any committee. However, today, as mayor, deputy mayor, mayor pro tem, we have 2 different wards. But what happens down the road if there's, the same ward has, deputy mayor pro tem? Can we exclude that, the council operations from that?
So if I could, I'm actually going to answer your question with a question, because I think that's an excellent point. And on the same venue, I think maybe it was you and I who had this conversation, although it might have been Gina and I who had this conversation. It's unclear to me, there's a requirement in here because these are formal committees that they actually be committees, that they're open to the public comment, minutes are kept. I'm not as persuaded that's necessary for the council operations, because it's really about how we organize ourselves and what happens internally. So I'd be interested in council feedback as to whether or not we should further exempt the council operations committee, not just for that first sentence, but also from some of the public notice comments. Just another question to throw out there for the group to consider. And I don't know, Kendra, if you had any more thoughts on that.
That's a good question.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot of questions. We're just going to move this direction. So Councilmember Joy, I think.
Can we get an answer to that maybe as far as the?
Oh, well, yeah.
So a legal answer maybe.
What if those are both part of the same ward? Personally, it doesn't bother me because they're kind of internal stuff, I guess, not regional stuff. So it's not something I'm going to lose a lot of sleep over if we didn't. If that happened, and it's also very unlikely to happen, but that's just my personal.
So would we address that in the section 4, just adding that committee is exempt?
Probably would be best to be clear.
Okay, I see Gina nodding. Okay.
Yeah, that would be an easy fix in the resolution. I just wanted to mention regarding the open meetings laws, if you do establish this as a committee, city code does require a notice and that you comply with all open public meetings requirements.
Okay, and Mayor, I did have another question.
Sure, okay.
Okay, so even though we're not on any of these committees, I think one of you 2 said that we all want to participate, and we may, but we can always attend these because they're going to be open to the public. We just would have to make sure we take that back seat of we're just an attendee, not a member.
Yes.
Okay, all right, great. I just want to make sure. We'd still get valuable input in that, so, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Joy.
Thank you, Mayor and Council, and thank you, Councilmember Owen and Shaw for your work on this. This is an excellent idea. I've only sat on one committee that was formed, no, actually two, that were formed during my years on council. But I guess my question is kind of a 35,000-foot view question, which is, clearly, the impetus for this is for council to really dig deeper into policies that are affected by these areas. What outcome do you see from these committees? So if one of the things that former council member Yakovich used to always ask, whenever someone was on a committee and it came to council with a recommendation, he would ask, is that unanimous? So, and then he would ask, how many council members were present? So I think the participation of the council members, it doesn't actually have that kind of language in there, but if you have a committee of one, the recommendation to me would be, well, that's not really much of a recommendation. So I guess maybe I'm asking a question that maybe is too soon, but it's kind of at that upper level. What outcome do you see from these committees, and do we have a structure in place to get to that outcome? Would it mean if a committee came to council with a recommendation on a particular policy, let's say we had one on the cannabis issue, and the committee then reported back to council, would that mean that that would create an efficiency where the full council wouldn't have a work session item on that issue, and the committee would simply do that work and come back with a recommendation? Thank you.
Councilmember Shaw, you want to
Yeah, if I could jump on that. I think it would depend on the scope of what and the breadth of what's being talked about. Like certainly with the Council Operations Committee, I would expect that they could come back to us with a recommendation on these, ordinance changes. That seems, bring it back at a business meeting maybe. I don't necessarily know that we need a work session on that. Cannabis, yes, we would have needed many. So I think in general, the idea is that they are an advisory capacity, but I guess I would see it differently depending on which issue. If we as a council said, hey, state legislative committee, can you focus on this policy topic and then bring it back to us at a work session, I see the committee also being able to function in that capacity of the full council kind of giving some direction of, we need a group to dive deeper into this. And so that would be the group that could do it and then bring us back the recommendations. So I see it going both ways.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think it's a really important question that you've asked, because I think it's important that we sort of separate in our minds two things. I see these committees as more of a oversight committee, not in an investigative sense, but in something that we constantly need to be monitoring and working on. So I think, like Kendra has said, the outcomes are going to vary by committee and by need. You're going to see more action out of the budget committee at certain times of the year and more action out of the legislative committee at certain times of the year. But we specifically say here, and I would just make clear again, that none of this takes over the ability for this council to establish the policy-oriented ad hoc committees. So we need a cannabis, or we need a this, or we need of that. Those things I expect will continue to create a recommendation for a specific piece of policy. The part of the reason that I think these need to be in resolution is they should be considered standing, permanent, long-term, with long-term horizons, working on these things constantly. So I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think it sort of flushes out the difference between our kind of ad hoc policy making and something that is more oversight over the long term.
Thank you very much. A question I would have is paragraph 6 talks about committee rules. And kind of in the middle of that paragraph says, second sentence, fourth line, the committee shall report their proposed rules to the council for approval, and in that report shall indicate whether staff support is requested. So they're to create their rules and also to get them approved by everybody. Okay, I guess one option is not to have everybody approve their rules. They're that committee's rules. They just could adopt them. I don't have any problem with overseeing that. but it just seems like potentially a risk of a lot of work and inconsistency of rules. Would the proponents, Councilmember Shaw, I don't agree, as long as I didn't have to draft them, that there'd be a standard set of rules, at least as a starting point. And then there'd be as much consistency as possible. If an individual committee wanted to meet and say, well, we really want to change a rule, or add a rule, then they could do it. But it does seem that there'd be value in some level of consistency. But I don't know where those would come from.
I mean,
I would recommend the council members Shaw and Owen. What would the rest of you say?
Shocking. I don't have any
objection to that, yeah.
Okay, that was I guess my comment or question slash comment.
I would say
Councilmember Shaw?
we might need a little direction from Gina. I don't know if there's any legal requirements there of things that we have to have in terms of rules. I don't know. So that would be the only piece that I would say.
There would be
we
some
may need some
requirements
legal help.
like that are already addressed in here, like you have to have minutes and how to handle public comment, things like that. But Gina, you want to comment further?
No, not really. I mean, I think that covers it. I don't think you have to have an extensive, complicated set of rules, because these are, they're working committees kind of thing. But yes, you need to address those basic procedural issues, minutes and stuff.
Okay. Councilmember Tricky?
I will take some responsibility for this since, I was one of the people that helped to push to have this happen. And I will also acknowledge the fact that I'm always saying we live in a bureaucracy, so live with the fact that you live in a bureaucracy. My immediate reaction was, oh my God, more bureaucracy. That said, just a couple of one question is, so did you consider breaking these up by topic area as opposed to by level? So public works, public safety, planning, stuff like that.
I mean, I think, yes, we had talked about that, but it starts to proliferate. And I think we had heard Councilmember Joyce say rightly, there's only so many hours in a day. And so it started to look like council members would sit on multiple committees and it would become burdensome. So I think what we tried to identify here are some of the bigger issues. I would note that I personally have a little heartburn that we don't have a land use committee. That's one that I would have advocated for, but I think we sort of, it started to spiral a little. So I would urge council to try this for until the end of next year, when we have new council members, and then let's discuss if we need more or different. But I think my concern was exactly what Councilmember Joy had previously mentioned, was to be conscientious of everyone's burden.
And we, in talking with Chris, too, have discussed, if staff should sit on these committees. Originally, I think we had in more of our proposal, staff members should sit on the committees, but really kind of backed off of that to more Chris can be the liaison. But these committees can also request staff support. So if the Public Works Director needs to come to a committee for some reason, that would be an open, welcome invitation.
Okay, well, the only reason I ask is that, it provides more consistency on the opposite side when we're dealing with our external partners, so there's more if the same group of people are talking about the same issue to everybody, it makes it a little more even. The other question I had was, I understand why you went with the numbers that you went with. My one concern is with budget and finance, and the two thoughts that came to me was that one becomes very political, because that's really the meat and potatoes of the organization. So not to have a ward represented in it becomes problematic. And the other thing too is it might make sense to have that actually be the first committee that anybody new coming on board be, since that allows them to get deeper into the nuts and bolts of how the process works. So just my thoughts on those. I have more coming up later.
Okay, Councilmember Tiswell.
Great direction. I just want to thank you guys. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Puritan.
So thanks again. I'm very much a proponent of doing this. On the legislative committee, I think, Ed, what your comment about not including some of the legislators with, did I understand that you said, let's not depend on the legislators to be a part of this committee? And I don't think we can dictate to anyone outside of council to be on this. But I would almost see it as really a bipartisan look-see at what the city can do, because I think that's kind of what they're working on right now with some of our public safety issues. So I would see that maybe as a good thing, if we could get some sort of bipartisanship on that committee. You wouldn't want to ask, everyone off of one side of the aisle versus the other side. So I think it is a good opportunity to do that. And I think you'll have a lot more success in the legislature if you have that. I guess my concern is we have had a hard time filling these, the boards and commissions with council members to be there as an ad hoc or as a ex officio. And I know there's some of you on council that still work, and for you to take on this as well. And is this going to be seen as in lieu of boards and commissions? Especially whenever you have new council members coming on, you're going to say, oh, well, you're going to have to be on this, this, or this. And then we've got these commissions and boards that there is an expectation. It's not a high expectation, I think, it's sometimes, of being on these boards and commissions as well. And they all meet different times of the day and the evening. So I'm just wondering how you foresee council members groveling to take their place at one of these boards and also on one of these committees. How do you see them with their time? Go ahead, Kendra.
I was just going to say, a part of the discussion too is about keeping minutes and all of that. And my understanding is there's no reason why these meetings can't occur on Zoom, that we could, make accommodations like that to make it easier for people to participate when they're traveling or in the evenings or things like that. So I think the committees, they get to decide when they meet, roughly how often, and what format that's going to look like. So I like that flexibility. I think it makes it so that people can participate. The difference I see between these and boards and commissions are much more subject focused, right? It's like the Parks Board, the Airport Board. Those are focused on specific departments often. This is much broader, and this is really council focused. So this is council business and how we do better for the city in terms of getting ourselves the information that we need and directing the processes we want to direct. So I see them as serving two very different purposes.
Well, and I agree. I'm not talking about purpose. I'm talking about time.
Yeah, so from my perspective, when we talk about the boards and commissions where council members are appointed to serve, I mean, from looking at Danny's list, I don't recall there being that many. I don't think right now everybody serves on one. I don't. So I guess I'm not as concerned about that. And I also think right now, the way we're structured, a council member needs to be an expert in everything. And I'm hoping that if we do these well, even though the main policy decisions stay here, you at least have a colleague that you can go to and say, hey, give me some thoughts on this. Help me think about this. And so ideally, it should actually lessen your load. Even if you're serving on one committee, you've got other people you trust on budget committee or this committee or that committee that you can go to instead of trying to be a master of everything yourself, would be my hope.
Well, darn. The other point too that was made earlier was whenever they were talking about, what the outcome of these council advisory committees are, or standing committees, I almost see it as an opportunity to get that pro-con outcome, because you're not going to have, hopefully, on each one of these standing committees, that everyone is really going to be in agreement. But you'll come up with, oh, well, I didn't think of, well, this is why I don't agree with that. So I like that. I like that tension there, because I think it makes us think of, we have to listen and, excuse me, we have to listen and we have to think about what really is the goal. Excuse me.
Thank you, Councilmember Boyette.
Thank you, Mayor. Every year, actually, I sit down with Andy on the blackboard and say, Andy, I don't understand this. And we draw it on a piece of paper on the chalkboard. I'm thinking that that's what this 3 members would actually do, and then say, come back to the council and say, well, we met with Andy. We didn't understand the following 3 things, and we drew it on the board, and now it makes sense, and then present that to the council. No way is these people going to tell you how to vote. They're just saying, this is how we worked it out, and we think this is going to work better. So I really encourage this to work, because I think I, as a council member, should have been been not forced and beaten, but asked to be on a committee 43 years ago, and said, this, you would understand it better if you did this as a group. And I like the idea that if I don't know what's going on, at least I could say, these people are on a committee, tell me what you think and give me some opinions. So this is a good deal.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Rupsis, and at that point, I think everybody's had a chance to pose some basic questions, and we will move to a more general discussion. And then a reminder, this is just one of 3 subject matters in item number 2 we have to resolve. So Councilor Rupsis.
Thanks, Mayor. Actually, I just had a question on just logistics. I mean, I think it's one thing for us, and first of all, yes, thank you. Lots of thought and went into this, obviously, and appreciate it, and I'm ready to sign up for a committee, whichever one, doesn't matter. But in terms of logistics, it's one thing to ask everybody to be on a committee. It's another thing to say then, okay, now you are responsible for taking minutes and making sure that we've got this all captured. What kind of staff support do you see for that, as well as the other subject matter expertise that we're going to need to tap into? I assume you've already coordinated with Chris or Kevin or whoever on those types of things. Can you tell us more about what kind of demands we're going to be making on staff times?
So I'll address the minutes, which my understanding, and Gina, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that if we record these meetings, that can serve as the minutes. And so that would be my expectation, is that that's what we do. And then, what was the other question? Subject matter expertise, do you mean from staff? Yeah, we've been talking with Chris, and that's why we originally had, I think we'd requested someone on the budget committee. Do you want to jump into that?
I think it's part of sort of why we want committees to kind of, you've got a general scope here, but then let's put some teeth to that and what your rules and structure are, because it will look different, I think, for every committee. None of these committees have a right to sort of direct staff or require staff, so it really does need to come back to council to say, we've thought about it as a committee, and here's what we kind of think we're going to need. Is everyone on board with that? Can we give that direction to Chris to say, you know what, Andy, you got to go to every budget meeting, but, you know, we're going to need Debbie for maybe for some ledge stuff and this, right? So I think committees need a chance to think about that a little bit themselves and then bring that back to the council, and then we can collectively go, that's way too much staff time, or, you know, we don't have the expertise we need.
Thank you. If I can just jump in to comment, this was something I was concerned about. The minutes and the recording was exactly where I was thinking. But we still need to have a way to make sure that happens, and a way to store that information. And also, when you know that that's out there, maybe it's a good thing, you have to watch what you say. You know, it's a little bit different than just you got a very simple set of minutes. So we may still want the simple set of minutes. The other thing that I'm a little concerned about is when you have small committees, you have a big public meeting quorum problem. All of a sudden, we've created the Billings or the Yellowstone County Commissioners situation. So on the Budget Committee, if those 2 council members talk, they're having a public meeting, technically, which is really frightening. And I'm thinking maybe Gina can figure a way around that one. But you see the problem that we've created. That's one of the great advantages of a large group like this. We can have a lot of very successful internal discussion without triggering that quorum situation. So I just want to highlight that to people. On the issue of involving legislators on that legislative committee, I think it'd be problematic personally to have them voting on what our quote position should be or recommending. But the whole idea is to build those communications, right? So inviting them in a broad spectrum in a very intentional way to be part of the discussion with the committee seems to be a no-brainer to me. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out. Gina, you want to comment on the problem of are we creating a public meeting nightmare?
Well, I hope not. That's certainly one of the first things I was concerned about. I think that the committees will have to be careful about, especially if there are, for example, the legislative committee is the largest one. And so if other council members decide to attend to observe, but they're not really part of the committee, then you are going to be having more and more people there. So the committees will need to be careful about how these discussions are handled. Clearly, only a quorum of city council can take action. So you all need to just be careful about the kind of votes and discussions that you're having and make sure that it's just advisory. You're discussing about what you're going to bring back to council. I think that as long as you make your roles everybody understands our role and the purpose of the committees, I'm not concerned about it as long as everybody understands that.
Okay, to be continued, Councilmember Ripsis?
Yeah, on that point, what about these committees that have 2 or 3 people on it? Does that mean that those two of those people can't ever talk about that topic outside of a public committee meeting? Because that would technically be a quorum of that committee?
I don't really think that means that. No, I mean, people always encounter other people and have discussions, and as long as you're, well, and even at these committee meetings, the committees aren't going to be taking any formal action. They're all just going to be discussions. So we're providing the public notice and the opportunity for the public to participate, but really these committees aren't ever going to be taking any formal action.
We'll just make sure in making the appointments that any of the very small committees are just staffed by people who hate each other and would never want to talk to each other, except when they had to. Maybe that's it.
Much less agree with anything.
Yes. Councilmember Owen and Nice?
So I would just note, for what it's worth, other Montana city councils do this. There must be a way to address this, because I'm quite certain that none of them avoid talking to each other, although maybe they're not as collegial and wonderful as we are. But there must be a way to address this, and I think Gina's advice is well taken.
Councilmember Nice?
No, I think Gina addressed that well. I don't think there's going to be an issue with this. It's advisory. It actually states that we can't take action. So even if we did meet and we voted, it's void. It doesn't do any good.
Okay. What else do we need to do tonight with this? My sense is, by way of summary, there is a consensus in favor of the general concept. That remains. There may be some changes that need to be fiddled with based on the conversation, although I don't remember a whole lot of big ones. Does this just come, do we want this to then go on a future business meeting for adoption? Kevin, you're raising your pen?
Yeah, just a couple of comments, and you guys kind of touched on it, but from, administration standpoint, if we just can have clear expectations of what you're expecting from staff. And again, so we don't, get in conflict with the charter or anything like that, but I think that'd be very clear, so we can allocate staff time appropriately based across these. And I think it will be very committee specific of what that would look like, and then who's responsible for what, as far as, okay, is it truly council? You're going to be responsible for notice, minutes, research, unless you, come and say, okay, we need some specific research or something on that. So from our part, that would be very important for us to know.
Is the expectation that there would not be necessarily a staff person assigned to every one of these committees? Councilmember Owen, Councilmember Shaw?
I would only say that in my conversations with Chris, he has expressed anxiety in both directions. He is both concerned that no one is there to watch us and concerned that we will take up too much staff time. So I don't have clear guidance, at least from Chris, as to what he feels comfortable with. I would just, I think what Kevin has said is correct. It's going to vary by committee, which is why I think we put in here, we want these committees to come back after they've organized and said, here's what we think we need, so that those expectations are clear. Kendra, I don't know.
No, I agree with that. The notice piece, I think, is a good one that we need to follow up on to find out what we would need to do from the council side to get that information, who we need to get that to, and all of that. So I've made a note of that I do think we need to address that one.
Okay, Councilmember Joy, and then the question I will have is, should this come back for another work session? before it's prime time. Councilmember Joy, or is it ready for prime time?
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor and Council. You know, I'm just kind of thinking, I'm sort of scratching my head because not being a person that knows everything, I know nothing about the process for purchasing. That's one of the things mentioned. I'm not clear. I know that in order for the city to put out an RFP and RFQ, there's lots and lots of staff time that goes into putting together the elements that go out as an RFP, RFQ. So when I look at some of those areas of responsibility, I don't know what I wouldn't speak for any other council member, but I really don't have a background in the kind of process and staff time that goes into coming up with some of these things, that process. So I'm thinking, yeah, that there's going to be a really big learning curve for members of council, which is a very good thing. And I think that's probably one of the real important purposes of what we're trying to do here. But how to learn that process without having somebody telling you or you going through it, seems like it's going to be kind of a steep learning curve. Purchasing is a pretty specific thing, and it varies across departments. So anyway, that's just something to think about.
Okay, thank you. How about next steps? Councilmember Shaw, what do you think about, does this need to come back with work session with further refinements, or come back at a business session?
I would certainly love to see it come in a business session. I think we can incorporate the edits that have been raised here. I didn't hear anybody raise an edit that freaked anyone else out, so I made a list of what those are. And then I think we can work with Gina on a staff memo that lays out things like notice and a website where things would be archived. I mean, I believe we can address the content in a staff memo and a revised amendment or a revised resolution draft. So, I mean, I would hope to get it on a work session as soon as possible, particularly because if we want to keep these on an election cycle basis, we don't want to short the first round too much.
Okay, you just said you hope to get it on a work session.
I'm sorry, a business meeting.
Business meeting agenda.
I apologize.
Okay. Further discussion on big picture, and then let's move to the business or the meeting rewrite ordinance. Councilmember Joy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah, and then we'll work down here. Sorry,
yeah.
even we just had you.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I would just ask if we could also have, as you work through putting together kind of how this is going to look for a business session vote, if you would incorporate some of the information that City Attorney Adol would about how we as committee members are going to conduct ourselves in a way that we're not running afoul of something. You know, so that it's clear. I'm not quite sure. I want to see my lane. So if that could be incorporated in some way in the way that the committees are run. Thank you.
Yeah, addressing those issues we've been talking about. Councilmember Owens, anything else on
Absolutely,
that?
happy to. Mayor, do you believe we need a motion to direct staff to put this on an agenda, or are we?
Not unless there's disagreement. Does anybody want that motion? No, I think consensus will, Kevin, you don't have a vote.
And do you know when that would be?
So it's going to be
Monday? Okay.
It'll be in October.
Okay, so the first business meeting in October.
We get it on
Is
there.
that reasonable for all council members?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else in the way of big picture discussion on this topic? Councilmember Ripsis, Neese and Shaw?
So if within 30 days of these being, of this resolution being passed, which is potentially the 1st of October, we need to have formed those committees, been appointed to the committees, formed, gotten our rules, all that kind of stuff. What's going to be our process for deciding who's on which committee? Probably because we probably, or just tell you and then you appoint us.
Yeah, and I guess what I would suggest is, in case we start seeing problems in that we need to address as a council, I would encourage you all, now that you see what is out there, to tell me what would be your choice recognizing that's not necessarily binding, obviously. And because you have to have one per council member, or I'm sorry, per ward, feel free to discuss it with your fellow ward member, but you don't have to, I guess. If there's a conflict, then we could identify that and try to work that out. But yeah. And what you saw there is there's 10 positions and 10 people.
So let you know before the first meeting in October?
Yeah, because then we can spot any problems sooner rather than later. Okay. Councilmember Neeson-Shaw.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, again, thank you again for Councilmember Shaw and Owen for doing this. I think this is a great idea. I fully support it. I did have a question, though, because I'd like to see this get done as soon as possible. We've seen agendas change, and we have a whole nother week before we have the agenda. And the question would be, is there enough time for you two to make the changes to the resolution in order to get it on the agenda for notice, which is, Monday, or I'm sorry, Friday is when we have to have final notice.
Kevin's shaking his head.
Councilmember Neese, if I'm understanding correctly, so October 10th would be the next business session that we could get it on, which would be into the clerk's office by September 29th on that date. So if that gives you enough time.
But I think he's asking if it's possible to get it on Monday.
It's not possible to get it on Monday. We've already published that agenda today.
We've republished agendas before online, and so it's not unusual for us that Chris or someone has made a change to the agenda and republished it. And so the question is there enough time to make the changes and then have it republished by Friday for the deadline?
I think it can be done, yes, if that's council's direction. Clerk's office, I can talk to them tomorrow about it if you think you can get the rewrites done. And then we're just talking about it. And I'm assuming that with all the rewrites that you've agreed upon here tonight, just go on the consent agenda, real easy type of, I guess, rewrite is what we're looking at.
So from my perspective, I don't think drafting the changes to the resolution is problematic. I would just ask Gina about the preparation of the staff memo and how much research she feels like she needs to do.
That was going to be my question. I agree. The resolution, the edits to the resolution are quick and easy relatively. But I wanted to get with you, Councilmember Owen, afterwards because I wasn't sure how much you were talking about. It sounded kind of like an extensive staff memo. I could put a quick staff memo and we could get this on an amended agenda relatively quickly, but it just depends on what all we need to have included in that staff memo.
My notes only show that council has asked to understand more fully quorum issues about conversations. I think you've been clear that as long as the conversations are advisory, not decision-making, that we're fine, but I think we should clarify that. The logistics of notice and perhaps where, and Kevin might know this too, where we could archive videos, if under the city council page, if there can be a council committees page. So I think we need to figure that out. I think we need to, in a staff memo, then otherwise just, I think, summarize the changes would be all we would need to do for a staff memo, at least according to my notes. I think the mayor has noted a desire for recorded minutes as well as maybe a shorter narrative version, but I don't think that has to be resolved. I don't think there's any research to that. Otherwise, the rest of them are just amendments to the draft.
And it just seems like a real rush. Is that rush that necessary? To get that extra week from your perspective?
I would say no, it's not that necessary. That I would rather go just a little bit slower and make sure it's right before we pull the trigger. But I'm also thinking, I don't think there's any reason why we can't already begin discussing which committees we want to sit on and start having some of these preliminary conversations even before the resolution is adopted. So I would say we do it that way, of maybe we start communicating with you, the mayor, of what we might want to serve on as this moves through the process, but we don't necessarily have to wait until October 10th. But I would be nervous about, I think there's a few more things to hammer out. I don't think they're complicated, but I would like to have it in writing before we are voting on it. and make sure staff is comfortable.
I just think as a matter of calendar, the question is, do we want to have these committees operational at the latest by November 1st or possibly operational after Thanksgiving, which I think is the reality of a mid-October sort of 30-day deadline after. I would love to see a scenario in which this resolution is approved and appointments to the committee are made at the same day. And if council members feel like, you know, they couldn't figure that out that fast or whatever, then I certainly understand. But I'm all for speed if it's feasible.
Councilor Owen, you referred to a 30-day, this is a resolution, so to become effective immediately, there's no 30-day waiting period because it's not an ordinance.
I apologize, Mayor. I'm referring to Part 6 where we ask committees to kind of start getting organized within 30 days.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And Kendra, I don't want to rush it either. And so I would leave it up to you guys. I think it can be done, but if you feel as you're preparing it to put it on Friday's agenda that it's rushed, then maybe that's the time to hold it. Okay. But I think that, I think there's a possibility to try. And if we can get it done on there, that'd be great. If you think we need to hold it for some additional research, then we can bring it back to the next work session, talk about that, and then put it on the next agenda.
I'm willing to give it a try.
Okay, so we'll leave that a little bit flexible. Question I guess I had for the council is this concept of de facto term limits on these committees where you would serve one 2-year period and then rotate for the second 2-year period. Is that going to be a requirement? And if so, should the resolution say that? Because that would bind the mayor. There's also going to be a certain power of inertia. Oh, so-and-so has been really good on the budget committee. We shouldn't lose that person. And that's going to create issues. People are going to say, well, that wasn't the plan here. I guess I'd encourage us to discuss that about whether that should be mandatory or not. Councilmember Shaw?
That was part of our discussions, is that it should be mandatory that you move between committees, that we don't have people camping out on one committee, and that everyone then would serve on the legislative committee for 2 years in one term and then on another committee for 2 years.
Then I would say we
should
need
clarify
term
that.
limit language in that resolution, however that shakes out. Unless somebody wants to disagree with that. Okay. All right, let's, are we ready to move on to the next topic? Councilmember Shaw?
So this is actually a comment about the next topic, which is that, do we even need to go into this right now? The purpose of these committees is really to throw this work to the Council Operations Committee. So I would suggest that we don't discuss that next.
I agree.
Let's discuss not discussing it, at least generally. Gina, can you, okay, so we've moved on to the next topic, and we all hear you, and I think we all agree with you generally. But Gina, can you just give us the big picture of where we're at with the rewrite of the ordinance that defines a lot of our meeting procedures?
Yes, I think I can. We are really where we were on August 1st. The draft attached to the staff memo is unchanged. While I did have some suggestions and edits, I didn't have very many. I know that the mayor and Councilmember Neese had mentioned that they might have some significant comments or suggestions for edits. So I have not made any edits to the ordinance. I have a lot more thoughts about some other things that should be addressed and changed. So I'd be happy to work with the committee. I don't think it's necessary to go into all those details now, but there are other things that I didn't include in the proposed ordinance that would be appropriate to address at this time for amending the city code. The proposed resolution for the remote participation is pretty close to final. I think that with the mayor's edits, I think we're pretty close. So I'm not sure how much work that the committee will need to do on that one, but I think that that's pretty close to being ready. And well, I was going to say council could potentially even address that before the proposed ordinance change, but I'm going to have to take that back because the new proposed ordinance provides council with the authority to adopt a resolution for remote participation. So they kind of are going to have to go hand in hand. But I think that that's where the ordinance draft stands. I hadn't worked on any additional edits because I really wanted the feedback first before I put more time into it.
Okay. So are there any questions for Gina about kind of this big picture of these other two ordinance change and resolution that's out there? And you should all have a copy of my changes, both by hard copy and email from this afternoon. Councilmember Purington?
I think I'm pretty much okay with the rules and procedures. And, you know, and I like Bill's additions, his wordsmithing to the resolution. The one thing that I'm not crazy about on the remote participation, and I suppose that's something that, you know, if it does go back to committee, to dictate the number of times, that 5, I'm not comfortable with, you can only do it for 5 times, and if you do it more than that, we're not going to give you, you know, access to the remote participation. I'm just going, what is this, like kindergarten, you know? So I just have a problem with that part of it, but maybe with the committee hashing it out, they can come up with some better language.
Yeah, and I'm solely not committed. I just threw that in because that was there as a starting point. I mean, the other option is to just leave it up to the mayor to make some determination, but also after a certain trigger point, require this larger body to weigh in rather than just having the mayor to decide. So Councilmember Tricky and Joy.
Yeah, so when I read that, what it triggered in my mind is what is the overall attendance policy for council members at the for council members? Because it seems to me if we're going to draw a line on remote participation, we should also be considering drawing a line about participation, period. We had a council member a few years ago who disappeared for months. And the only thing that was in there was that the mayor was basically saying it was an excused absence. And, you know, so I agree that we need to think about it, but I also think it needs to be thought about in context with the larger policy for attendance.
Sure. Councilmember Joy?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. That was where I thought that maybe this council should have a discussion about whether or not its work sessions are required for attendance. I think we should be really clear to the public and voters out there that if they elect someone, that person doesn't have to show up for half the meetings. Just doesn't. It's not required. And I know that we all want to just think that everyone will do the right thing, but there are always circumstances that sometimes people just don't want to do the right thing or they can't do the right thing. So I think we should be clear to the public and to voters, hey, our procedures allow an elected member of council to not show up half the time for 4 years and still collect the same amount of money. So I mean, if we're elected to represent our constituents and the city, and someone doesn't show up for 4 years, for half the time, I think voters should understand that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good point. Further discussion or questions about so is there a consensus that we're not going to get into the details? We're going to leave that Operations Committee to deal with both of those. Okay, so a lot of nodding heads. While we're all together, though, anybody want to express, as we've just been doing, position, concerns, questions about specific issues relating to either of those? And even if something occurs to you later, feel free to maybe contact one of the committee members now and pass that on as well. And certainly the changes that I sent out that people haven't necessarily looked at, please do so, as Councilmember Purington has done. Okay, anything else on this before we open up for public comment and kind of conclude item number 2? Okay, we will then open up for public comment. Do we have anybody? We don't have anybody online, and we don't have anybody present. So we'll close the public comment period on item number 2. Turn it to Kevin to see if he wants to enlighten us for our next meeting or anything in the future that we need to know about.
So I think the next really highlighted thing that's coming up is the low barrier shelter issue coming up on next Monday night. So pay attention to that staff memo in there. It was published out today. That's probably the big action item of the next Monday.
Okay. Any questions for Kevin on this item? Councilmember Owen.
Thank you, Mayor. I know there's been a lot of council emails. We've all been concerned about what's going on Lake Elmo and safety issues related to that. I had a chance to sit down with Chris and Debbie, really good meeting, and get a further understanding of what Public Works is doing to try to make that road safer. At that time, both Debbie and Chris indicated there would be a update to council on safety measures that were going to be taken or that could be taken if council were to address funding issues or whatever, sort of the strategy to make Lake Elmo safer, and that we would have that by the end of the month. I'm unclear if the plan is to put that in the last weekly of the month and then talk about it during the October 3rd work session, or if we're going to see it during the city administrator's report next week. So if we could just get some sense on when we're actually going to see those suggested action items or strategy to make Lake Elmo a little safer, I would sure appreciate that.
I will try to get you an answer.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Neese, Councilmember Gulick.
Thank you, Mayor. Kevin, will we be getting or any kind of updates on this task force that is meeting?
So Councilmember Neese, yes, we had one meeting so far, and it was just a real introductory meeting, and we've got another one scheduled next week. And then what we plan on doing is doing quarterly updates, and I did tell the committee that, or the task force, I guess, and it's not a strike force, Councilmember Owen. So quarterly meeting starting October 1st. So we should hopefully have something to you the first part of October. We don't know what kind of format that's going to be and whether it's just going to be in the weekly, you know, okay, here's where we're at type of thing, or an actual physical update. Again, our work sessions are getting very full of stuff, as you know, and stuff. So we'll try to do the most efficient method.
Okay,
but
thank
we
you.
do plan on giving quarterly.
I look forward to hearing how that's going. Thanks.
Okay, Councilmember Gulick.
Speaking of the weekly, the second item we had last Friday was the Polco National Citizen Survey results. And when I clicked on the link, at least, I didn't find anything of any substance on it. I don't know if anyone else had that experience, but I just, so I don't know if there's a better way of getting that information, but if you could maybe look into that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further for item number 3? Okay, we'll move on to public comment or general items of council discussion, I guess. Councilmember Purington?
So one of the questions that I had, and I'm glad that Gina is here as well as Kevin, is the public nuisance. It was my understanding that the city was going to pursue acting upon some of these drug houses and these problem places, if you will, that you were going to act on those legally. Because that was one of the things that I had talked about doing an initiative on, but Chris gave me the impression that you were going to start working in that direction. So, because those had been prosecuted before through the city. So I was just trying to get an update to find out what the city is doing with some of these properties that they're worse than people having trash in their yards. So I just think that, you know, there should be some abatement along with those properties. So I just wanted to find out kind of where the city is with that.
So Councilmember Purington, if I'm understanding correctly, and some of them are like code enforcement issues that we're looking at.
No, they're police, because they're the ones that, you know, just like with Catherine when she comes and she says how many times the police have been here and how many police have been there, but yet they continue to be there. And I guess even with Dorothy Lane, I mean, I don't know, but, you know, he's saying, well, gosh, we've had that issue since, 20 years ago. It was, I guess, a drug house then or whatever, I don't know. But the implication is there. So No, it would be law enforcement. You know, code enforcement can only do what's on the outside, but yet the issue's on the inside.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correct, that's part of this, task force that we've got together, and we're compiling the list of those properties that we see that are kind of covering those areas. Are they a law enforcement, issue that we've got going on, neighbors starting to deal with that? A lot of what we're finding is they're kind of crossing over, so they've got the law enforcement and code enforcement issues. Our next meeting, we're bringing in the fire marshal, the building division, those people, because there's a point there on some of the commercial properties that we can use them as leverage. And I think the Highland Apartments, that one of the wards that kind of alerted us to was kind of a prime example of, how can we work on those from a fire marshal's kind of standpoint. Along with that, I've also been in contact with some justice court judges just about landlord-tenant type of issues. I've been in contact with Riverstone Health about they get some complaints. So that's what we're trying to do, is kind of bring those all together. What properties are we seeing that are rising to the top? And obviously right away, it's, Dorothy Lane, Colonial Apartments, things of that nature that, those are the ones that we're going to make sure we've got that coordinated effort in moving forward with. And from my understanding, that someone who has been legally into the Colonial Apartments, some of this pressure has made a difference, and it's probably cleaner than it's been in a decade or 2 decades in some of those rooms and stuff.
So, so I guess back to my other question, with this task force, and you find that there's these issues, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to prosecute them? Will they go to city court? Will they transfer over to district court? I don't know the dynamics of how to prosecute those, because just to come together and say, yep, that's a problem, but what are we going to do about the problem?
Yeah, and when enforcement action can be taken, we'll certainly do that, and then it'll go to the appropriate jurisdiction, whether it does go to municipal court, if it's a misdemeanor violations, or if it's going, to district court for the felony charges. We'll work with the county attorney's office. They've, said that they're more than willing to help us out in those areas. So I guess I don't know if I'm understanding their correction correctly. Yes, we're going to try to take enforcement action when we can. When there's probable cause to make some charges or to cite people for certain things, yes, that's the intent.
And Kevin, I think my question would be, is the city at least researching the option of bringing civil claims based on a nuisance theory against these homes? Not misdemeanors, not felonies, those are a completely different animal, but theoretically we can. And I guess the other thing I would also say is we need to prepare a little bit of a brief white page for neighbors to say, here's what you can do. Because it's not just the city that has standing. If you're next door to somebody whose dog always comes into your neighborhood or your yard, which I think is great, but maybe you don't, that's a trespass. And you can sue your neighbor to prevent that trespass. Similarly, you could theoretically sue your neighbor to prevent nuisance. It's not just the city's problem, but that's a whole different thing, how we encourage private parties to take action or discourage them. But anyway, are we actively pursuing, and this is really a question, I guess, for Gina, civil nuisance claims?
So, and I will comment real quick, and then Gina can kind of tag on to that. But yeah, she's assigned us a city attorney, deputy city attorney, that is on this task force to help us for things just like that. Is this a case that we can go after, something like that? But I'll let Gina comment on, the probability or action that could be taken.
Yes, we have done a lot of research looking into what kind of actions we can take. And I'm not going to say definitively that there's an action that we can take, but I am going to say that we have been taking a significant, serious, deep dive into this issue. And Deputy City Attorney Thomas Pardee is working on this issue, and he's actually to the step where he's trying to draft some complaints, I guess I could just say that. But it's very evidence intensive, and so it's not just because somebody says it's a drug house, we can't just take an action because somebody says it's a drug house. We have to be able to prove the allegations. So the answer is yes, and I'll try to get you a better status update, maybe something in writing. it's more of a privileged kind of communication, so it's not something I'm going to discuss in a public meeting. The specifics of the cases that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
So just one other point is that it's my understanding, because I understand with the police department that, you know, they're limited on going into a building, a house, a residence, that probation and parole, they have a lot more leeway. And so if they're part of that task force, because they can identify people going in and out of the property, that they could actually move on it before the city could. So is that someone that is involved with your task force as well?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, we'll use every resource that we can, you know, and again, I mean, so that problem property is going to have somebody that's on probation that's listed that as a residence too. I mean, so yes, I mean, we'll look at every resource we can to help us try to, you know, bring some either enforcement or relief to property owners.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, council discussion? Councilmember Boyette and Nolan?
Thank you, Mayor. One of the emails I told you before that we got was a citizen said, well, why don't we establish a curfew for these kids out at 2 o'clock in the morning? And you mentioned, Gina, that we do have a curfew ordinance. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. Let me just pull it up here again.
Well, she's pulling it up.
Go ahead.
While she's pulling it up, we do have a curfew in the city of Billings. Weekdays, it's 11 to 6, I believe, and then weekends, it's 12 to 6, and I think they got to be able to either 12 or 14. But I think what you're wanting to get at from our conversation is the teeth. Is there any teeth to this curfew? And that's, I think Gina can answer that.
Yes, I can answer that. There's really not a whole lot of teeth here. As Kevin just indicated, there is a curfew for those under 12. It's 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. For those under 18 years of age, it's 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., except on Friday and Saturday, which is 12 midnight to 6 a.m., and except in the summertime, then it's 12 to 6 a.m. for all minors under the age of 18. Essentially, what the curfew code requires is that when law enforcement finds a minor out on the streets or in a public place, that they essentially just take their name and address of the parents and take the minor home or contact the parent and to make a report within 24 hours, but it's unclear as to who gets that report, but essentially it's simply to contact the parents or to take them home to wherever they live. There isn't any other enforcement. It's not like you can arrest a minor. That's it. The code number, it's that specific one, duty of police is 18-605.
Could you say that again?
18-605.
So we didn't write the parents a letter. City council doesn't write the parents a letter. Yeah, we'll start down here to Councilmember Shaw gets the first 2 years of that duty.
So Kevin, do the cops do anything at all with this at all, or just ignore it basically?
Well, I'd have to say it's, you know, at officer discretion. So what are the kids out doing? I mean, I can recall from my days of doing it, if there's certain specific actions, yes. I mean, you get a hold of the parents or you at least call them saying, hey, I'm sending your kid, you know, home your way because they should be driving home. And then again, I mean, it depends on, you know, the responsibility of the parent, how many of them really care if you do call or if you do say that. So it's mixed.
And I guess I should say that there is the ability to, I guess, cite the parent under certain circumstances. That may be a difficult thing to do, but there are circumstances where that would be appropriate, but that would be a municipal infraction with those civil fines or civil penalties.
Okay, let's get this meeting wrapped up before our curfew is up, okay? Let's see, Councilmember Owen and Neese.
I will be brief. I notice on our work session of October 17th that we're set to have an update on the public safety mill levy implementation generally. I think that's great, but I think we need to take that show on the road. I think we owe the public an explanation of what's happened a year into the mill levy. So I would hope that if other council members agree, we could have a discussion about doing multiple meetings around the community, not just the task forces and the library, although those are important, but different times of day, different days of the week, and really give the public a chance to hear what's been accomplished, to hear what's immediately next, the next priorities. And I think council members should be up, when they're in their wards, they should be up there taking questions and fielding those questions as well. I think it's an important time for the public to weigh in on what their frustrations are, what they're seeing go better. But I think we need to do that accountability to the public. So I would invite other council members to share if they have that same opinion, but I would sure like to see that be more publicly oriented. And then just because I think Councilmember Purington mentioned it or said something that triggered it, there was some conversation previously that council members were uncertain if they could attend the Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee that meets once a month. I believe that committee is chaired by Judge Jessica Fair, and she says absolutely, council members can attend. You can attend in person, you can attend by Zoom. She would gladly share that link if people would like to attend on Zoom. I think it's the first Thursday of every month, but council members are absolutely welcome. So thank you.
Councilmember Neese, is that what?
Yes. Thank you, Mayor. And Jennifer, I agree with you, especially after we learned tonight that County Commissioner Oslin has indicated how we're not spending that money appropriately. I think that's very important that we get the message out that what we're doing with that money. Kevin, I guess I'm questioning along the lines of the same things with a lot of people hanging around town. We see, I live near Lake Elmo, so I see a lot of people coming in late at night into Lake Elmo and yelling and screaming, and then they drive out. But that's not our facility. We can't lock that up. But our parks, are we locking our parks up at dusk? Because are they doing that? Are they making sure that they get locked up is it dusk or 10 o'clock at night when the park's closed?
Yeah, and I guess, define locking up, because most of the parks are.
Meaning that the cars can't get into the parking lots. Have we got any kind of swing gates, or should we be looking at putting swing gates on some of the parking lots to prevent people from hanging out in these parking lots?
So you're talking more up on the rims those types of parks?
The recent complaint was the rims, but I'm sure any of these parks that have these parking lots are where people are driving to and hanging out.
Yeah, I think I'll have to check. I'm not quite sure on some of the other parks, but I know some of the problem up on top of the rims is that it's, the right-of-way section there where a lot of people hang out and do that is not city parkland. So that's one of the issues that we're dealing with, in certain areas up on the rims. But as far as some of the other parks, I'd have to check if whether, if they're, driving into them, whether they're locked up at night or not.
Is
yes,
that
that's the rule.
Patrolled by the highway patrol there? Is that what that land is, the state road?
Yeah, and I'd have to confirm with Chief St. John. I know he put out an email to somebody regarding that, but I believe it's in the right of way, so it would be state property is my understanding, but I can confirm with that.
Okay, so
that's part of the issue.
He's notifying some of the activity that's going on there, so they can kind of also help patrol that?
Yeah, I mean, our patrol does have jurisdiction, and can enforce things, in those areas. But again, I mean, it's not a city park, so it's not, we can shut them down at a certain time.
Right. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other items. Oh, public comment on non-agenda items. Anybody like to comment on non-agenda items? There's nobody present, nobody online. So that public comment period is closed and we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.